On this episode of Still Loading... Hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Still Loading. This is another episode for the summer of PlayStation 2, and this is a very special episode of the podcast for two reasons. But the first reason is I have a returning guest, a guest who I've not had on for quite a while, the gamer David himself. Game Dave, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing great. Thanks for having me back on.
It's been almost 2 years since I had you on the first time. The first time it was an interview, and this time we're actually kind of doing something that I've always kind of wanted for any return guest, like anyone that I've had on interviewed before, to come back on for like an actual episode, something that is, well, I shouldn't say an actual episode, but like an episode we're talking about a game versus just an interview. So as I've been doing with everybody for the summer of PlayStation 2, what is one of your earliest PlayStation 2 memories, or do you remember getting the PlayStation 2?
I think, you know what, aside from maybe the Super Nintendo was my first console that I actually purchased myself by saving up money. And by the time I had enough money, it was already the Mini, the Junior, was the only one available that came with Yoshi's Island. And I believe the PlayStation 2 was the next console that I actually purchased myself. And I remember, you know, everybody talks about how the PlayStation 3 was like the crazy expensive console when it was released, but I remember people talking about PS2 and be like, man, it's so expensive. But again, I was younger, so maybe that's why we just thought it was super expensive. I think I got it around the same time as some of my buddies did. But yeah, I remember purchasing that. I remember the sort of deep blue box that it came in. That's probably my earliest memory of actually purchasing the console, and I cannot for the life of me even recall what games I would have started with on the PlayStation 2, honestly.
That's for us, it was the first thing I think we put in there was either I think it was a DVD when we got it. And I've told this story before on the podcast, but we got a DVD for Christmas, the same Christmas we got the PlayStation 2, and it was, when my parents showed it to us, she just kind of said, "Isn't that cool?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's cool." It was VeggieTales. It was a VeggieTales DVD.
Okay.
And I go, "Oh yeah, that's cool." And then I just kind of ignore it. I'm like, "Whatever, it's VeggieTales." I was a little old for that at that point. And she's like, "No, look at it." I'm like, "Yeah, it's a VeggieTales DVD." Oh wait, DVD. And my mind freaked out, and we got the PS2 from there. I tried to paraphrase it for those who had already heard it before, but it's okay, so since you can't remember one of your first games or earliest games, what are some of your, besides Final Fantasy X, that was on one of your top 10, what was one of the earliest games you remember playing? Not necessarily the first one.
Right, and I'll be honest, it may have been Final Fantasy X because it wasn't much later that Final Fantasy X was released.
Less than a year after the launch.
So it's very likely that was my first game because I did not get the PS2 at launch. Not until I got older, and was a real adult did I get anything at launch. I think, man, I don't even know. The Wii U I may have gotten at launch, just barely. And then the PS4 I definitely got on release day.
That's the only console I've ever gotten on release day was a PS4. It still works, too, which I'm very pleasantly surprised by.
Oh, yeah, solid for sure compared to our PS3 woes. But, yeah, Final Fantasy X was a big one for me. Disgaea, I really like tactics games, so that series, there's just so many Disgaea games that I've gone through. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, which we talked about a little bit earlier. and I know that's a juicy episode for your listeners that's already coming out. But Baldur's Gate, I was a big Baldur's Gate fan, and Dark Alliance kind of threw me. And with that, the X-Men Legends games, I remember.
Those are great games.
Yeah, getting the multi-tap and, doing 4-player X-Men Legends, that was like a big deal. And then I think I was irritated with Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance because there were 3 characters in the original, right, that you could choose from.
Yes, there's a dwarf warrior, an elven ranger, I want to say, and then there's a sorceress.
Right, and you could only play 2 players simultaneously on the first one, and I believe the second one you were able to do more than 2. I'm not certain, but I think
the second one's worth a lot of money, so I haven't been able to add it to my collection just yet. I did notice the price for that drop, though. I remember it was over 100 at one point, and now I think it's like 50 for it.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. Luckily, I had it early on, and it had a weird point where it was a little pricey. And I think it has come down significantly. But I don't know what the PlayStation 2 collector's market looks like, but you would think the way that retro games or what is retro goes, there was like an era, the NES, anything about the NES was popular. NES collecting was crazy, and then it kind of shifted and Super Nintendo games started to get really expensive, and then N64 was crazy and still is kind of crazy. And then PlayStation 1, and I'm wondering when or if we've already hit it where PlayStation 2 is going to be the new, like, oh, I remember PlayStation 2.
It's very cyclical. There's a couple episodes I want to have you back on for. I'll talk to you about one of the other ones after we're done recording, but one is actually the collecting in general, because you are a big collector. You have a very large collection, and one of the things that actually drew me to your videos is just kind of seeing all the unique stuff you have in it. But in terms of the PS2 collecting, it's already started. If you look at, do you have any of the dot hack games for the PS2?
No, but I remember even early on that they were expensive. Luckily, I have no nostalgia for those games, so I'm not like upset if I don't get them. But I know that dot hack vary, and there's so many of them.
There's a couple that expensive. Are like over $100 already and they usually came in groups of 4. So there's dot hack dot hack whatever part 1 through 4 or whatever, and there's a game for each of them. Some of them are already over $100. So if you want the full set of that dot hack story, you're looking at $400 to $500 for the set, which is just that is so much money. And even what is it? Ico, the original, or Eco, I guess. The original Eco, that price fluctuates a ton.
Yeah, because they had the remaster, so you would think naturally it would go down in price, and I think it did, because I know Shadow of the Colossus was never a super expensive game either, and we obviously got that kind of remaster. I loved, that's an experience I definitely remember. Shadow of the Colossus. A couple of my friends are like, "This game's boring," and I'm like, "It's not boring. It's just epic." Kind of like, did I fall asleep during the second Lord of the Rings movie? Maybe. But it's because it was so epic, not because it was boring. The scope was too large for my brain, so I fell asleep. But, I think with Shadow of the Colossus, it didn't even feel like a game. It was like an experience, because you see the Colossi coming out as like these gigantic creatures, and that's really all you're doing is climbing them and stabbing them in the head. But that never felt repetitive to me. But yeah, Shadow of the Colossus, that was definitely a game changer when it came to like the games that I was playing on the PS2. It just felt so 100%. Different.
Well, and spoiler alert for those listening, that is going to be an episode later on. Actually, I guess not so surprising. So what I'm doing is the last episode of the summer of PS2, which technically goes into the fall, is going to be on October 25th, because that is the day before the North American release of the PS2. And that's going to be a big PS2 retrospective. The episode before that is Shadow of the Colossus, which I think is, I don't know if it's the best game from the PS2 generation, but it is within the top 10, I would argue, just in terms of notoriety and polish and everything. It's just I have a lot of stuff to say about the game, and so I gotta hold back. I gotta restrain myself for that episode.
Yeah, because in the sense of like video games as art, Shadow of the Colossus is a great example of that because it's just a cool game to look at. And I know, everybody, not everybody, but the PlayStation graphics, that's something that a lot of people like to dog on for it not aging well. I always hate that. It didn't age well.
I don't think it ages that awful, personally.
I don't think so, but I think there's going to be, because I don't know what I was watching, but somebody was kind of talking about how there's a difference in looking back fondly on graphics in the way that they age and being nostalgic for the look of sprite-based games and how they kind of, stand the test of time. And then they were talking about how, certain PlayStation games, how would those stand the test of time in the sense of like looking back fondly on the awkward polygonal graphics of the PlayStation 1. And I don't really agree with that, but PlayStation 2, I will say there was this certain games at least, and I think Shadow of the Colossus is guilty of it as much as it's a great game, has this sort of smeariness to it, if that makes sense. Sort of this like the graphics had this weird trailing to them that always kind of threw me. And maybe it isn't something that we would have noticed because obviously PS2 is not an HD console and we were playing it on CRTs, but to see it now upscaled or whatever, trying to get the best footage from it has this sort of, I don't know, just like this weird smearing to some games, not all of them, but I don't know. I think Shadow of the Colossus definitely has this weird trailing thing. And I don't know if that's just on purpose or just a limit of the time.
I do think it a lot, especially with older, with games back before pre-HD, and I guess any era, like any era that's not the present, that you're not used to the current modern pretty graphics. It whether a game holds up visually depends on its art direction more than its visual fidelity, I would argue. So like if you look at games like Sly Cooper on the PS2, that game still looks pretty nice. It still looks visually appealing. It looks like aesthetically appealing. But if you go, and it was an early PS2 game, but then you go back to like Medal of Honor Frontline, which is one of my favorites, that doesn't look that good. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing game. It was designed very much for, this is what looks good right now, not necessarily what will look good later on. It's not like they could have known that either. It's not like you can be forward thinking with design, because that's more luck than anything. Right. But like there is some elements that you can look back and be like, well, this is just good art direction. Even if you're talking about PS1, I think Metal Gear Solid 1, the art direction still holds up really well with that game. I still think that game looks, I understand the graphic, like the actual polygon count is pretty low, but they do a good job with how they use that polygon count to their benefit for what they were going for. To tie it into Final Fantasy X, which did we even mention we're talking about Final Fantasy X today?
Briefly, you briefly dropped it, briefly.
Well, we're talking about Final Fantasy X today, and to bring it into Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy 7 through 9, with 7 with its blocky graphics, you can make the argument, but I think that I'm more nostalgic for 7's graphics than anything. But like 8 and 9 have pretty good art direction in my opinion, because their 2D backdrops combined with like the way they modeled their characters look pretty good overall. There's moments that don't look great, but for the most part, I think they actually hold up pretty well.
It's almost like when they try to go too far and try to do too much with the graphics is when it's a struggle, because I know there's that meme of Squall at the party, with his rough looking face from Final Fantasy VIII. And that they even reference that when they released the remaster. It's like, oh, you can actually see what his face was supposed to look like. And don't even get me started on that, because I almost did a video on Final Fantasy VIII remastered and just be like, Final Fantasy VIII Remastered is not Final Fantasy VIII. That's kind of what I wanted to call. Just because graphically, I think what they did, so here it is, coming out right now, the only time I'll say it,
is still loading exclusive.
Final Fantasy VIII Remastered. Great, yeah, lost source code, whatever. Well, I don't even understand how that works, but it's weird. But the face of Squall that they were touting, and they were like, look at Squall's face. Look at this face. How great this face is. To me, he doesn't look anything like he's supposed to look. Because if I was going to remaster and increase those textures and clean all that up, the cutscenes look the same, right? So Squall's face, to me, I when I visualize what Squall would look like in real life, there's two sources I pull from. One is the front cover of the strategy guide, because it was a fairly large shot of his face.
Yes,
and
I know
that
exactly
is
what you're talking about.
right. And that's, to me, that's what Squall looks like. And the other shot is that close up of him as they're about to make their landing in that cutscene when they're about to land.
For
Right.
the seed mission.
Right, and it's that close up of him. They slide the map over, but that close up, which is the same render, pretty much, that's on the guide. That is Squall's face, right? Because that's as true to life as the game ever got, even back then. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't you try to model his character model off of that?
They didn't.
But I don't think he looks anything like that face. I think they were like, you know what? We got Kingdom Hearts 3's new, he's appeared in Kingdom Hearts. Let's make Squall look a little more Kingdom Heartsy than how he should look in the world of Final Fantasy VIII. And that's what kind of frustrates me, because I have my own issues with Kingdom Hearts. But I think,
kind of see what you're saying now.
Yeah,
I
doesn't
looked up a
he?
picture of it.
Yeah, he has. I think Squall in Final Fantasy VIII Remastered has a Kingdom Hearts-esque look to him. Like they were like, let's just kind of use. We already have this sort of model of him. Let's just kind of base it off that. Because if you look at the other characters who have not been in Kingdom Hearts, their faces, I think, are good remasters of what they would look like. Quistis and Selphie, I think they look great. But then Squall stands out. It's almost like he's a different styled face when it comes to the others. So
I would agree with that. They actually made it's in a weird way. The reason why I don't think it works as well is they made his hair more realistic in how it and how it drops and how it kind of flows naturally off the side of his head. Because like when you look at the remake of it, it's very much like it's like the hair just kind of naturally flows off to the side. But in the original, you have the top part flowing off to the side, and then you have these awkward ones going against the grain over his face. Like his bangs go against the grain of the top of his hair, which is not possible and very weird, but it looks good on the PS1.
Yeah,
it worked on the PS1.
So I wonder if that's something when it comes to like the way games age, because you have, a game where they had Final Fantasy VII, which I think is easy to go back to graphically. Final Fantasy VIII, going back to the original on PlayStation, if you're not playing it on a CRT, is kind of tricky because it's so, they push the modern look, they're more detailed, and I think because there's more detail, you actually lose fidelity in the way that it can be seen later, so it doesn't feel the same way as like the Cloud in-game model versus... Because even if you look at the models in 8 are very similar to the models in battle. So the field model is pretty close to what they look like in battle. FF7, as you know, is not like you have the very blocky Cloud, you go into battle, and you have a very nice model of him. And it's very clean, very smooth angles, still cartoony. But I think that Cloud looks amazing. Whereas I think the Final Fantasy VIII Squall model does not translate as well to like an upscaled look at him.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yes, because they went so, maybe not hyper realistic, but they were trying to have these very human looking, real world characters, and adding all that extra detail, I think, made them not hold up as well as one that was less built up as they are in Final Fantasy VII. And I love Final Fantasy IX, but I would say the same thing for 9. They're so detailed that seeing them, we obviously got the sort of HD version of Final Fantasy IX, but the backgrounds, of course, have still suffered because they didn't really scale those and repaint them. But the characters just, it doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't feel as iconic to me, and I love Final Fantasy IX.
Final Fantasy IX is the only PS1 Final Fantasy, like in the main series, that I never beat. I actually got to the second to last boss. I was almost at Kuja, and I wasn't quite high enough level, or at least I didn't have enough strategy to use my lower level to my benefit or anything like that. So I ended up beating it on a friend's copy because I was like I was literally the boss before the final boss. So it was I was right there. It was probably another 20 minutes of after that I would have finished it, and maybe an hour of grinding beforehand or something like that.
Yeah, one of my closest friends, same situation. He, to this day, would probably be like, oh, I don't like Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX was too hard. And I was like, really? And it really is just that fact of you did have to do a little bit more grinding because 9 is a little more throwbacky, a little more classic. Whereas 8 was like, you know what? Let's not throw the manual out for Final Fantasy 8. Let's flush her down the toilet, and we're gonna make a whole new crazy thing where leveling up doesn't really even matter. And I mean, I could talk for hours about that. But
no, it's funny because I think the reason I liked 8 so much when I first played it is because I actually had a strategy guide the whole time.
Oh yeah,
when I played it, I think that is and I guess it's kind of an indictment against the game because if that's the way, if I enjoyed it because and I had the strategy guide, everyone else who played it without the strategy guide, the normal way you're supposed to play it, and they didn't enjoy it, I think that is more telling of the game than my experience. I just liked it because I don't know why I used a strategy guide even. I think I kind of used it because I wanted to find. Like, they would tell you where all the different spell draw points were in the map. Like, there's a hidden aura draw point, and aura just breaks the game if you can get enough of it.
Oh, yeah. My best friend, that's how he played the game. He played it with the strategy guide. That's how we met. We actually met in, I think, 8th grade. So we were in 8th grade, and we had, I remember, Mr. Hockaday was our English teacher in 8th grade. And he was like, he was like a first-year teacher. Because we went to a school where it had too many students. So in the clutch, in the final sort of months or weeks before the school year started, they had to create, because back then, I don't know if they still do it this way in middle schools, but back then you were sort of broken up into teams. So there was like, blue, orange, red, green, whatever.
They had
tan.
Something similar for mine. It was different names, but same idea.
And that's how they kind of split up the group of teachers that you would have. It's like, oh yeah, Mr. Hockaday, he's part of this group. But so orange team didn't exist. Okay, there was like these ones that had been around for a while, and like tan team was known as like, oh, that's where the high kids are. And,
tan.
Yeah, tan
color.
Way to go, tan. It's a level above khaki. And then what happened was we got these letters at the very, like right before school started that some of us were assigned to this orange team that never existed. And it was like this known thing that orange team was like this weird throw it together at the last minute because they ran out of space in the school team. And they had all the teachers were like first year teachers. And it was like this weird smattering of kids.
The Wild West of 8th grade.
Absolutely. And we're in English, and Mr. Hockaday would always have, that sustained silent reading, SSR time, where, it was 20 minutes silence, and you had to read. Didn't matter what you read, but you had to read. And I looked over, and this kid had a Final Fantasy VIII strategy guide, and that's what he was reading. And I was like, Final Fantasy VIII? And I was starting to play it, and I was like, Final Fantasy VIII? Really? Because I was all coming off of 7, and I talked to him about it, and then found out that was like his first Final Fantasy game, and mine was the NES original, and that's how he played it, was with the strategy guide. And I'm sort of a hybrid of the two, where I'll play a new RPG, I'll play it blind, and then I'll go back, and then my second time through is when I'll strategy guide it, and I have to do everything.
That's how I've always wanted to play an RPG, but I never make it to the second playthrough. But that's literally my same thought process. I'll play it once through to say that I beat it without the help, beat it on my own, and then I'll play through it again to get to see all the stuff that I didn't get to see the first time.
Time permitting. Sometimes I'll be like, all right, I'm going to bring this guide out halfway through because I don't know if I can get through this a second time.
I don't blame. I mean, even now, like I will still periodically go to a guide even for first playthroughs, but it's not because. It's generally because, okay, I only have 2 hours to play today. I don't want to waste 2 hours trying to figure out which wall I have to randomly run into, or whatever the challenge may be that the game's presenting me. So I'll look up something else, because I'll go through a bunch of options. I'm like, all right, this didn't work, this didn't work, this didn't work. And then when that doesn't work, I'm just kind of like, all right, either I spend the next 2 hours hoping that I get this right, or I can just look this up real quick and then progress on with the game and not use. And I don't use the strategy guide after that. I use it for like one individual moment, and then I move on from there. That's more or less what I've been doing now, because I hate feeling stuck in something. I want to keep moving because I only got so much time now. I don't
Oh
have
yeah,
time
and
to just
strategy guides have changed. Like it's not like it was in the early RPG days where pretty much every RPG had like a dedicated strategy guide, and a lot of those strategy guide companies are gone. Like they've gone out of business, which I was not aware of until I started to find out that there are strategy guides that are super expensive. And I think this is wrong, but I the general idea of it's not wrong because I just don't remember. But I believe, coming back to our actual topic, Final Fantasy X, which had its remasters, the HD remasters, there was a specific, I believe, PlayStation 3 Final Fantasy X 10.2 HD remaster strategy guide that was released. And I think it was one of my viewers is actually the one that made it clear to me because I tweeted, because I was at Second and Charles, a sort of used bookstore, and they have a strategy guide section. So that's where I'll usually hunt and pull old RPG guides because they can get expensive now. And I was like, oh yeah, Final Fantasy X 10.2 HD. I guess I'll get it. I have the original guide, but why not? So I picked it up. It was like $8 or something, and then I get home, and I was like, well, this isn't even that old of a game to me. I wonder how expensive the guide is new, and sure enough, it was like $80 or something crazy. And I believe it was one of the last, again, I'm probably wrong, but I think it was one of the last guides that the company released. And I don't know if it was Brady or, I don't think it was Prima, because I think they're still around. But yeah, it was like one of their last ones before they went out. So now it's like even Final Fantasy VII Remake, I don't think there's an actual strategy guide. 15 had a hardcover, legit, deep strategy guide when it came out, which I picked up. 7 Remake, I don't believe, has a strategy guide, and that feels weird to me.
It's just, I mean, because everything is so online, and I'm thankful they at least have it or detailed, because like you probably know this as well. The Final Fantasy IX strategy guide is one of the worst strategy guides I've ever.
Why? It's play online, bro. It's so good.
Why read it in the thing that you bought, and you can just go onto a website that doesn't exist anymore?
It was perfect for you. It allowed you to do exactly what you wanted. Just little tastes to get you through it. And it was like, oh, this spot I'm stuck on, I'll go online for the real information. I think that's what they were thinking.
So what? It also probably saved them money too. It was a win-win in their minds.
Now I haven't gone through it because they did that re-release, that like hardbound special edition of the 7, 8, and 9 strategy guides.
Really?
That came out. Okay. And I don't know because it's still shrink wrapped because it's not like I actually need those guides right now. But I wonder if the 9 guide, because the other 2, as far as I know, are just drag and drop of the paperback guides that came out originally. I'm wondering if 9 is like the most complete version. I wonder if it has all of the play online stuff all self-contained in the book. If so, that's amazing. I'm not certain. Yeah. And if I'll have to, you know what? After this, I'm probably gonna rip it open and check, and then I'll do a video. The Ultimate Final Fantasy IX guide. Yeah, find a PDF. That'll be the video. The Ultimate Final Fantasy IX strategy guide. The strategy guide you wish you got. Because I was frustrated with it too, because I always bought the FF game with the guide, at release. And I think 9 was one where 8 did it too, where there was like one that was foil, like had the holofoil cover, and then there was like the plain one. And 9 did it as well with its play online guide. And yeah, I remember trying to like download and pull off the site all the play online pages, and it was like just impossible because the way it was coded, it wasn't like a PDF or anything. What garbage. Yeah, it really was garbage.
Especially that was before high-speed internet. That was all dial-up. So
I'm
sure they probably had a lot of visuals knowing Square Enix.
And it was it was a great guide when you got on the play online side of it. But yeah, the whole idea is it's right there. And I get it now. It definitely paved the way for what it is now, because it literally is, even with Final Fantasy VII Remake, I did it. I didn't play it blind. Come on, I'm not going to lie. None of you did. I'm sure somebody out there was playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, and they're like, oh, I don't know. I don't know what I should do here. I'm just going to look it up real quick. Wait, she's asking me what dress she should wear to our date.
Yeah.
Let me
so you're
just.
like, well,
I just
what's
want to see
the
what
best
they
one?
do. What's it? Oh, that's the exotic. Oh, hello. So, like, everybody has to have looked up at least one or two things and dropped on IGN or some walkthrough from a game news site. But yeah, nothing official yet.
100%. All right, it's been 30 minutes already, believe it or not.
Oops.
No, I do not mind in the slightest. I love this type of stuff. So let's dive into Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is the first entree the series had onto the PlayStation 2. It was released in Japan on July 19th, 2001, and released in North America on December 17th, 2001. So actually, it was a little over a year after the initial release of the PS2 in North America. I'm just correcting myself from before. The overall, some of the biggest differences in this game compared to previous entries. One, it was the first pretty much fully 3D Final Fantasy, because everything else, in PS1, you had a lot of the character models were 3D, but the backdrops were still 2D.
Yeah, pre-rendered.
This one went everything. Like, everything was 3D. And I'm sure there was some 2D backdrops too, mainly for skyboxes and stuff like that. But
well, there were 2D backgrounds in the world map, which hot garbage, worst world map ever.
I agree. Now, actually, real quick, do you miss the days of having a fully explorable world map in RPGs? I'm talking Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 level type of things.
Yep.
I don't know if it's a good design choice now or if it's just nostalgic. I don't know if it would work in a modern context. I feel like it should. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't.
And here's the thing, when it comes to those, I was having this discussion with someone who knows nothing about video games recently about how trying to explain, we were talking about FF7 Remake because obviously it's on my mind. Look out for the Digitally Distracted episode all about Final Fantasy VII Remake and my thoughts, but soon. It's on my mind. I'm always thinking about it, and we were talking about, because he doesn't know anything about Final Fantasy VII, and I was explaining to him that it's a piece of the story of the original, and how the Final Fantasy VII Remake stops before you would have entered the world map in the original.
Yes.
And I was trying to explain to him what I meant by world map. He just didn't. Because if someone who doesn't know what an RPG world map means, you would think, oh, just a map? Aren't you in the world? You're walking around the world. Isn't that, what do you mean world map? It's like, no. World maps in an RPG are this other experience outside of the actual in-game areas. And they almost always follow this sort of trend of you go into a town, it's fully realized, everything's to scale. You leave that town, you're now on this separate world, which is the world map, where things are not to scale. And that's
you're the size of a town walking around and exploring.
Right. And it became that's the way it is. It's not weird. Now someone on the outside might be like, well, that's stupid. Why is he as tall as this entire town? And when you go into it, it's this huge town. It's just the idea of a way to push sort of almost like old tactics maps where you'd have this old,
I was thinking like the Indiana Jones cutscene, the Indiana Jones scene. Like, how do we make the Indiana Jones scene of him flying across the world with the dotted lines into a gameplay concept? And there you have world maps.
Yeah, well, that's the Final Fantasy X world map, if we're being honest. But
yes, it is.
When you look at, say, I was playing you know what it reminds me of? It's almost like I was playing this VR. I finally got my Vive hooked up, and I got the wireless adapter for it. And the area I'm in right now, my office, is mostly empty, and that's where I've been using room scale. And there's this it's not great, but it's fun just because it's VR. I believe it's called Shadow Legend. Is that what the name of it is? I haven't played it in a couple months, but I was playing it, and there's an area. It's sort of like D&D, sort of that world, and you're this like legendary sort of figure that saves the towns and stuff. And you go into this war room, and it's just like classic thing you see in movies or back then, where the big map, the big atlas is laid out on the table, and they've got these little pawns that are set up, and they're pushing them around with the little, and setting up strategies. Okay. So my mind is an RPG world map, at least the classic style, is that realized, but you can control the pawn that's moving around on the world map. But I was showing my buddy Final Fantasy VII, the original, to explain to him. I was like, well, when you leave Midgar, you enter the world map for the first time, and you're making your way to Calm. It's the first place you go. And I was showing him a picture. I was like, okay, so this is Midgar. This is me in Midgar in FF7 Remake. This is Final Fantasy VII when you leave Midgar. And it's just, I sent him a picture of the model of Cloud standing outside of Midgar. And he was like, oh my gosh, that's what you mean. I know, yeah, it would, that's my fear, because we were talking about, I was basically saying to him, what are they going to do when you leave Midgar? Are they going to Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy 13 us, where it's going to be this linear hallway of a world map that leads us to Calm? Is it going to
be like Final 15?
Right. Will it be an actual open world? I highly doubt it, because 15 was so barren. That was one of my big complaints with 15, is that it was this huge, it was open world, baby, we did it. Final Fantasy in a modern open world game, and there was nothing going on until you actually got, like, so it was just, which is why the car was there, I think. You're driving on the highways, so the world map was highways. There wasn't a lot
to explore in that world.
No, because you're at the, Cindy's, the mechanic shop, and it felt like a gas station in the middle of nowhere, Phoenix, Arizona. There's nothing around you, just desert and some mountains, and maybe the occasional little shack. And that was a huge disappointment, and I hope they don't do that. If they do, and they actually fill the world with things, that's great. Because if you look at the Final Fantasy VII map, it's pretty basic. It's just a lot of grasslands, and then down the way you'll see a town. Oh, and then you touch it, and you're in it. There's not a ton of interesting things. So how you expand that to be a modern-day world map, I would honestly not be upset if you leave and it's like a little model of FF7 Remake's Cloud, and maybe the party trailing behind him, and you are running on an old school world map, but they would never do it because it would take people out of the experience, I think. But I would be like, that's awesome, or even give you the option to do that. It's going to be something linear, I think, or it's going to fade out as you leave Midgar, and it's going to fade up, and you're in Calm. And then when you leave Calm, it's going to fade. It's like, well, we got to travel to Costa del Sol. It'll fade out, and you'll fade up at the entrance to Costa del Sol. That's what they'll probably do.
I think, and that's a bummer too, because I think one of the benefits of having a world map is it makes the world more fleshed out from a storytelling standpoint. Because now if you asked me what is the layout of the world of Final Fantasy X, and I logged when I initially played that game, I logged over 100 hours into that game.
Same.
That was one of my biggest. That's one of the games I played the most of on my PS2, and I couldn't tell you how that map looks. I have no idea.
Yeah, I just know
Final
it's
Fantasy
a bunch
VII,
of dots.
But Final Fantasy VII, I can tell you, like, if you're looking at Midgar from a map, Calm is like northeast a little bit, like kind of northeast, and then you go down this, through this valley, in between these two mountains, and you get to the Chocobo farm right down there, and then a little bit north of that is the swamp where the monster is, where you have to get the Chocobo to run across, and then you have, like, I can picture it in my head. I can picture where things are at, and like if you ask me how to get to the northern crater and like what the continent looks like up there, I can.
Yeah. Same.
And even games, I shouldn't say lesser, but games that I put less time into, like Final 9. Like, I love Final 9, but my only complaint with the Final Nine's open world is they crammed a lot into one continent, and then the rest was all very barren. But that one continent, like the three warring kingdoms between, I'm blanking on their name, but I'm blanking on all the different names. But I love Cid's kingdom in the south. You start out in the kingdom in the northwest, and then kind of like, I think Freya is the dragoon in that game, and I'm pretty sure her kingdom's in the top right. But I still remember all that, and it's been probably 20 years. Alexandria, that's it. It's
crazy that 10, and I think of like, oh, let me see, what does Besaid Island look like on on the map? Oh, that's right, it's a dot. That's what it is.
Yeah.
It's a dot, and then there's a trail, because it's so linear. And then when you get the airship, it's just I mean, you don't even
it's still just dots though, because
Yeah,
you're just picking from a list of different places to go.
Yep, you don't even get the enjoyment of, because that's in every Final Fantasy game. That's what you look forward to, is when I find the airship, I'm going to be able to fly over all these lands and go wherever I want. And then you get the airship in 10, it's like, oh, I can't wait to tap on that dot, yeah, or go through the menu and just choose the name of the place I want to be. I love this text adventure style world map.
And I know we're complaining a lot. I mean, I think it's a valid complaint too.
Oh, I love
the world
10.
map.
I do love
But
10. Let's say that up front. But
they're you always take the good with the bad.
Yes.
And overall, I think I had this theory when I was younger, and it's not actually a good theory, but it's it was me trying to work through, trying to learn how to look at games with a critical eye. And I always try to look at each Final Fantasy game as one thing that the developers went over the top with, like something that was to me that stuck out to me more than the rest of it in the game. Like with Final 7, it was the world they built. With Final 8, it was its battle system, and for better or worse, but that battle system is very complex.
Yeah, I like to poo-poo on 8, but I already poo-pooed it on this episode. I literally said how they threw the gameplay style in the toilet. But yeah, 8, I really played a lot of Final Fantasy 8. I hated the junction system. I thought it was so cool that you could like create these scenarios where you're absorbing elements, and I hated the magic system in the sense of it being this consumable, because I hate using consumables in role-playing games. Like, I will hoard potions and everything.
And it disincentivized you from using it because you had a junction it. So, like, what's the point of getting rid of something if it's going to hurt my overall stats? Like, it incentivized you to never use magic because you were junctioning. So there is problems with it, but that junction system is fantastic. I mean, I shouldn't say fantastic because it has flaws, but like at its core, it's a cool idea.
Yeah, it was and it felt so technical. I remember the tutorials when you first are playing 8, and it's like, junction this to your strength. I'm like, whoa. But then it's like super simple to understand once you actually start doing it.
It's just that learning curve.
Yeah, and it you said making the magic almost, you don't want to use it. Same thing that I thought with Final Fantasy 15. I didn't really use magic at all. It's been so long since I've played it, and I even reviewed it, and in my mind I'm like, I vaguely remember the magic system, and I'm like, wait, isn't magic, they're just grenades? You throw grenades of magic at people? I think that's what Final Fantasy 15's magic system is, but 8, the same thing. Very rare that you would really want to use magic. And but 10, 10 great magic system.
And in 10, for me, the thing that they went over the top with was the world that it built. Like, that world is so fully fleshed out. They have, a different language in it. They have entire religions that are like warring with each other.
Yeah.
They have, it actually kind of reminds me a little bit. I haven't beaten it, but like Final Fantasy Tactics and how that world was built.
Man, that is one of my favorite games of all time, for sure.
I got very far into it. I was actually playing through the first time like 3 years ago. I was kind of behind on it because when I heard it wasn't like a normal Final Fantasy game, I was like, what? That's dumb. And then like years later, as I, kind of got over myself in those aspects, I tried it out, and I ended up getting to the Wheatgraph fight, I think, which is pretty far into it, I believe. And I beat him, but I had over-leveled my main character so much that any of the regular battles now kicked my ass because he was the only one that could actually do anything and everyone else was under-leveled.
Yeah, that's exactly... It was so unique, but it broke the game. Similar to Final Fantasy VIII, where leveling can be good and bad for your character, because if you're a level 100, which was also interesting, it was like one of the few Final Fantasy games where the cap was 100 and not 99.
Well, the fact that you could easily get to 100, like you could easily get to 100. With Final Fantasy VII, you would beat the game, like 50s to 60s, sometimes even in the 40s.
Yeah.
But like to work your way up to level 99 was impossible. I mean, it was long. I had a friend who did it, but that takes That takes days.
Yeah, and then with 8, the monsters, similar to Tactics, they level with you. I wonder if when they were working on 8 and they had Tactics, they were like, you know what, maybe we should put a similar thing where enemies, where the bosses sort of level with you. Because the regular enemies don't, as far as I recall. It's the boss battles that level with your... So if you're level 100, the bosses are way more difficult to deal with. In 8,
yes.
But Tactics is the reverse.
The reverse.
Yep, where the final fight is a joke if you've power leveled your characters. But then you get stuck on the waterfall random encounter stage where you got red chocobos just destroying you, and you're like power leveled, you've mastered all the classes. But what I loved about that is there was still a place that I could have a challenging fight. But there was also the thing of like the fear of, man, I hope I don't hit a random encounter when I go by this field area. I'm just trying to beat the game, but because they're so strong. Like, it's sad that chocobos were way more dangerous in Tactics than the final boss ended up being.
What I was thinking, I have to go back to do it, but I might try to take out, who's the main character in Tactics? It's been like 3 years since I played
Ramza.
Ramza. If I take him out of the party and I have all the lower level players, all the lower level characters, excuse me, I'm hoping that it would scale to those characters, not to my highest level character that just happens to not be in my party. But I will have to test that out at some point. It's been a while since I played it.
Yeah, I don't know if it does. I also don't even know if you can take Ramza out.
I think you can, but I have to check. Anyway, so with Final 10, the world that it built was just so in depth. And actually, one of the things I was looking up an interview with Yoshinori Kitase. Did I say that correctly?
Yes, that sounded very good.
He was talking about how a lot of the previous Final Fantasy games in the last couple were very medieval themed. Like, one of the things that a lot of Final Fantasy fans liked or wanted back after 7 and 8 was they wanted that fantasy element back into it, not that high tech thing. And he even mentioned in an interview how a lot of times, for some reason, people picture a very medieval Western style, like high fantasy, pretty much.
Yeah, which 9 kind of delivered on.
Exactly. And 6 even had, it was more like steampunk, but that had a very like medieval Western kind of fantasy. But with 10, he wanted to make it a much more Asian centered thing. He wanted to add more Asian ideas into it. And one of the things that I hold on, let me flip the page and I wrote it down. Yeah, they wanted to make a world with customs and cultures that were familiar to the development team. So that's why Final 10 has a lot more, like a lot of it's like religions, like they bow to each other. You don't really see that in like Western religions and stuff like that. And so in general, the whole game had a much more Asian feel to it. And I think that was cool because it's still very much a fantasy world. It feels like a fantasy world, like in the same vein as high fantasy, but in just a very different way.
Yeah, you know? It's kind of hard to explain. It's very much like, like a Hawaiian Final Fantasy game, which is interesting because I believe Hironobu Sakaguchi hangs out in Hawaii, I believe, or lives. Or has a place in Hawaii, which is interesting because he was not really involved in Final Fantasy X, so that's kind of interesting.
I guess one of the first things I want to talk about, I mean, let's just get it off the table because it's going to be complex and it's going to be a bit of a ride, but the story of the game. The story is something I actually really like, but it's taken me years to understand it. The basic premise, and correct me on anything that I screw up here, because I'm also I did some research, but I'm also going from memory. You play as a character named Tidus. I always pronounce Titus, but
most
Tidus.
Did. Yes.
And you play as a character named Tidus. He is the main character of the story, and in the early parts of the game, you find out he's a blitzball star, and blitzball is a fictional sport within the world of Final Fantasy X.
Yep, that happens underwater, and they never explain how they breathe
ever.
Nope.
And it's kind of like, it honestly kind of reminds me, I don't think they knew much about Harry Potter at the time, but retroactively, it kind of reminds me of like what Quidditch is.
Yeah, it's like Quidditch except in water. Yes. Yeah.
and like it's not the same roles, but it kind of it kind of looks like that to me. And but Titus, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna get over that. Titus is on a way to his to a blitzball match in this city called Xanarkand, and in the midst of the blitzball match, this giant monster, which you find out later is called Sin, attacks and throws Titus and his friend Aaron, who you meet there, into the world of Spira. And Spira is this big. It feels very, like you said, it feels very Hawaiian. Like there's a lot of oceans. Like all the cities and towns kind of have a more tropical feel in general than you're used to. And even the most advanced cities, they still have a very kind of tropical feel compared to what you're used to in Final Fantasy in the previous installments of the series.
I can't think of a single. I mean, I generally think of Costa del Sol as like the only place.
Only thing I can think of.
But other than that, like very, very little of the worlds have had that feel.
And he meets the first person he meets is a girl named Riku. She is a scavenger, part of a group called the Gullwings, if I remember correctly.
Sounds right.
I'm actually amazed I remembered that because it's been a minute since I've played it, and that she is a part of I don't know, are the Albed a race, or are they like just a group of people? Like, is it like a?
I always got it definitely felt like a race, the way that they sort of pushed it. And they pushed it that way with a lot of characters, where I kind of felt like almost all of the characters had their own sort of, like they were part of their own ethnicity. Like you have Kimari, his group, Orin and Titus seem like they're part of the same race in a way. But yeah, the Albed seem like their own. It's almost like if they've got a different language, then it gives me the impression that they are.
It makes it, but the Albed also seem like maybe they're just from a different country. I don't know. It might not even be a race thing. It could just be a different country.
Yeah, it's possible.
He's drifting, or no, sorry. He actually wakes up in the ruins of a temple, and you're trying to find fire. You're trying to find wood to start a fire so you can stay warm, and then a monster attacks you, and Riku comes in to save you, and you join her on their salvaging vessel, or their salvage ship, and you kind of work for them for a little bit, and then Sin attacks, and then you wake up on the shore of Besaid Island, I believe. I think that's the name of the island where you meet Waka and Yuna, right?
Yep, that's his hangout. That's Waka's place.
And we're not going to go through the whole story beat by beat. This is just kind of the intro, because to go through any RPG story beat by beat, you would need a couple hours.
Yeah.
But after you meet Yuna and you kind of understand what she is, you find out she's a summoner, and you kind of start learning about the teachings and this religion surrounded by Yu Yevon, who's the creator of this religion. Do they even give a name for the religion? Do you remember? I don't think they do.
Do they just refer to it as? I'm trying to think. It's not faith with a Y. That's something else.
So faith with a Y, I actually had to look it up because I was so confused by what a faith is. And a faith with a Y, there's a whole Wikipedia page.
Yeah, that's like some mad spoilers getting into the faith stuff, actually. Maybe we should save that for the
we'll go
big reveals.
We'll go into how a faith affects later on in the game, but what a faith is, they're humans who willingly gave up their lives to have their souls sealed in statues and commune with summoners, and they have with whom they've established a mental link.
Is it just Yevon then? Because Yu Yevon is like sort of this figure head within it, so maybe the religion is Yevon, I believe. I think that's right, but it's the convolutedness of it is classic Final Fantasy.
Well, I think there's a balance in any video game where you create a world that's so advanced, because that means you have to explain that to an audience. And when our world is complex enough, so if you create a world that is in a similar level of complexity, just completely removed from, like, Spear is completely different from our world, but when you have that level of complexity with races and religions and cultures and practices, and you're trying to see and who hates who and who loves who and what allies and all this other stuff and all these different social norms that they do a pretty good effective job of communicating through this game, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
because it takes children literal years to absorb the culture of their world, let alone an adult to understand a completely new culture, or not even adult, but like a kid to an adult, whoever's playing the game, to understand a completely new culture. It's just it's a lot. So when we go into these things, it does take a bit to kind of unpack. I actually, like, looking back on this, I think 10 has probably some of the better, like, less convoluted stories. I mean, it's still in depth. It's still a lot, but it doesn't feel as convoluted.
Convoluted is probably the wrong word. It's just I was 'cause it's interesting that you think about most RPGs had religious references or iconography in them in the early days, and it was one of those. It was one of those things that was weirdly always censored when it came to North America. Like if there was a cross in a game, Nintendo was like, "Whoa, easy!
We can't have that." But then, meanwhile, you look at Bionic Commando and Hitler's head explodes.
Yeah, right. And I never understood why religion being such a big thing. I guess the idea is because I don't know if it was Nintendo of America making that decision or if it was Nintendo of Japan being like, well, Americans really love Jesus, so we better hide.
Not insult Jesus.
We better not offend them by showing iconography in something that isn't specifically Christian. I wonder if that's
and vice versa. Sometimes
yeah.
people who aren't religious don't like religious things thrown in there, so they probably were trying to appease it from both ends. I would argue it's more the other thing. Like Christians in America are very passionate about their religion, and they don't want to step on that because that'll hurt sales numbers.
Right, and it wasn't until much later, like PS2 era and on, that they just kind of that sort of stopped being an issue. Which is funny because Final Fantasy X was a game that they kind of came after. Because of the way, because Final Fantasy X sort of like the biggest portion of 10 is religion, and that's what it really explores, and it explores sort of these negative depictions of organized religion, and it's kind of showing how organized religion is bad and causes issues in the sense of having power over people. And I mean, Seymour, what? And then I believe that they were kind of comparing it to, I think, Catholicism is what they were trying to say.
And that's not surprising considering Final Fantasy Tactics did a similar thing.
Right, yeah. Now to me, Tactics felt way more in the sense of like the Holy Wars is what Tactics kind of feels like, where, you know, you are here to defend God. And Tactics really, really pushes that, and then throws in the Zodiac for some reason. But but 10, I believe it had some pushback in the sense that it was showing sort of how, you know, organized religion is the wrong way to look at religion, whether you believe that or not. Is kind of what I think. Not that it was anti-religion necessarily, but I think it was anti-certain structures of religion, maybe the legalistic aspects of religion is kind of what it was. We're getting deep. We're getting deep here, Josh. You better reel it in.
This is good.
And I think the organized religion aspect definitely pushes more towards Catholicism and the Catholic Church. And can I drop the spoiler ending now? Because it seems like a perfect time. What Final Fantasy game are you going to play where the final battle is you have to kill God? Is basically
there's a bunch of JRPGs that I feel like came out around this time that did stuff like, I think Star Ocean did something similar like that, where you have to kill God. Well, I see. I didn't actually interpret the final boss as killing God. I considered it like, it was weird because I grew up. I'm fairly religious. I'm not like, obviously I don't get offended easily by people who disagree with it. But it's like, when growing up religious, I didn't take it that way. I took it as like, this is what sin does to your religion. Sin perverts your religion because when you look at what everyone's doing right now, when you look at Yuna, because you find out, I guess to summarize the story in very simplistic terms, just so people know what we're talking about at the ending. When Tidus meets Yuna, he finds out she's a summoner and she's about to go on this pilgrimage to basically, she's deemed the next, I I don't remember what the name they call it, but think of it as like the summoner, like the main summoner. I forget what they call it. But she has to go on a pilgrimage to Xanarkand, which is where Tidus was from, and he doesn't understand why Xanarkand is now destroyed, and it's 1,000 years later from what he knew everything was. And he's
also he is very attracted to Yuna.
Yes, that's the other major element. Their love story is is on a personal level. The love story is probably the main focus of the game, and then the whole message of the game is definitely like that religious aspect. But Tidus eventually goes to Xanarkand, and he finds out that in order for Yuna to defeat Sin, it's only going to bring peace for 4 or 5 years, or however long the peace times are, and she dies. Yes. She will die from it.
She is the sacrificial lamb summoner and she knows this, and Tidus does not know this until much later, and he's like, no! And we all know Tidus is dogged on for being whiny. But,
he's an emotional guy. He's just an emotional guy. He gives into his emotions.
Yes, gosh, yes, he does. Even laughter or sadness, whichever.
Yes. The way I interpreted as a kid, and like kind of looking back on it from my religious background and my religious mindset, is that this is what happens when sin perverts your faith, because you see all the people who are earnestly practicing it. You look at people like Yuna, and you look at like people like what her father did and stuff like that. And Lord Braska is Yuna's father, and he did the same pilgrimage. He was the same thing that she was, that she is. He did the pilgrimage and sacrificed himself for it. And the whole thing was started basically by a summoner who kind of went wrong, which I think is Yevon.
That's Yevon. Yep, Yevon is the faith. So you have like Yevonites or whatever they're referred to, and then you have the like the sort of split off denomination of the new Yevon people, who are like, well, we believe sort of, which you have in Christianity, where you have all the different denominations, and they have these slightly different doctrines, and that's kind of what's brought in Final Fantasy X with New Yevon, and then you have Yevon, which follow Yevon. That's where it is. Yevon is like, he was the guy that sort of brought these followers, and Yevon is who the final boss is in a way.
You find out he's the one that is pretty much, he is sin,
right? And he's not. He's not really God, but he's this God like. You're basically killing.
God's emissary.
Yeah, the final fight is against a denomination of religion.
Pretty much. And like then that's where I think I came at it from, is because when you look at, I mean, even without even going into too much religious aspects of it, like there's a thing called false prophets. It's mentioned in the Bible.
The final boss is the Pharisee of Yevon.
It's a false prophet. And there's people who, like right now, what a lot of people consider false prophets without, I'm going to call these people out, but Joel Osteen and like Kenneth Copeland, those are like the big televangelist speakers that kind of
Josh, I don't know if you know this, but if you pray hard enough, did you know you'll wake up rich?
Yeah. Prosperity gospel be damned. That's one of their big things. And so it feels very much like an indictment, and I'm sure because Japan in general is a very secular country, so I'm not surprised that but they loved to infuse their art, video game art especially, with our what is seen like Western religious iconography and ideas. And like you said, tactics. That was spot on. Tactics is like a great example. It's a very scathing indictment of like the Crusades, pretty much.
Yeah.
And so they, that's the whole thing. Like that's what sin does to a religion. Because if you were to look at, I can't speak for every religion, at least with mine. If you were to look at it at its core, it shouldn't be as problematic as it is. But it is problematic because people pervert it and people twist it. And I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to go into a whole
and the general idea,
religious
even
thing about
10,
specifics, but it's just that idea overall.
Yeah, because the idea would be that people are imperfect, and it is, how can you have a leader that is following something that is imperfect. So they are going to naturally over time pervert it. And that's where you have in Final Fantasy X, Yevon perverted the idea of what life and religion is. And then you have to, you might say Tidus is the dream warrior of Final Fantasy X, if you want to get into what happens at the end. Basically, that's what it is. Yeah, it's about Yuna. It's really a story about Yuna. Yuna's like the main character, and you are watching what's happening through Tidus's eyes.
Yes, that's a good way to think about it.
Tidus is really not even the main character. Yuna's the BA, bad A character of Final Fantasy X, and you are just this sort of, at times, sniveling fella who's there. You're helping, though, because your purpose and destiny is specifically to help in this mission, if you want to get into what happens with you and then leads into 10-2.
You would know. I don't know much about 10-2, so we'll dive into that towards the end of the story here. You probably know more than I do about that.
I know enough that it's tricky. I think it's weird because now we'll get into that. Remind me to say what I think about how 10-2 is perceived nowadays compared to how it was received when it came out.
Okay, so I mean, along the way to where we were talking about, like, just to kind of cover some major plot points along the way up to where you find out that Yuna is going to sacrifice herself, and you're going to fight against Yevon. You're going to fight against the prophet that started this whole thing,
specifically,
or whatever
Yevon.
he is.
Yeah.
God, prophet. I mean, I it could be anything. That's just how I interpreted it. But at the same time, it could very much be like, no, this is God. This is the thing that created this world, and it's perverted now. I wouldn't be surprised if it was that too.
And can we talk about how in your battle with you, Yevon, which the game does sort of frame it, because I remember my buddy, my best friend at the time, we would talk about how it's like, all right, I gotta kill God now. Here we go. It was like this joke, and the other joke was because there's a big battle prior to that with Papa Papa and Yunalesca, all that stuff. But, you got your issues with Jecht, and you find out who Jecht really is in this sort of world.
Jecht, by the way, for the listeners, is Tidus' dad.
Right, and he's sort of always lived in the shadow of his father, and he has a lot of daddy issues. Again, whiny boy Tidus, which a lot of people like to dog him for.
Pay attention to me.
But yeah, exactly. And Jecht and all that really works into the ending, and that's tough on Tidus. And the final fight is not the final fight. The fight prior to the final fight is the real fight, because when you fight Yevon in this sort of fairy-esque battle, you can't die. It's actually impossible for you to lose because auto life is on you the whole time. So it's like,
you're right.
So it's almost just it's a cut scene that it's almost like a quick time event.
Yeah.
Because it's not really, there's nothing you can do to lose. It's becomes this weird thing of the game is telling you this is the destiny. It's inevitable now that this is how the story's going to play out. This is my story.
And when you get to what you find out, well, as they go along through the story, Yuna gets betrothed or engaged to this awful person, this douchebag of a character named Seymour. And he's actually from a race of people called the
Guados.
Right?
Yeah.
The Guado.
Which makes me think of Ace Ventura. Because there's the other detective or the other cop, the more unfit fellow. And he's like, "What's up, Aguado?" And I always would think of Final Fantasy X, like when I was like, Aguado.
I'm just picturing now, like, anytime you play FF10, it's just ruined for you. Like, the serious moments of that, you see Jim Carrey over top of Seymour's head.
Tidus is Ace Ventura.
What's up, Aguado? No, so Seymour is a religious leader. He's one of the higher religious leaders, and he's got a pretty tragic backstory as well. Like, Seymour, I looked up some stuff about him that I was surprised by, because like I knew he was a religious leader. He was pretty much an asshole, and he was just using Yuna for his political power, and that's the whole reason he was marrying her. But Seymour, he let me see. I'm on the Wikipedia for him now, but he hides his twisted desire to save Sierra by becoming sin and destroying the world. So he's trying to become sin.
Right.
And this resulted from his father's treatment, who I'm reading this verbatim, his father's treatment, who had his wife and son exiled to the island of Baj. I don't know if I said that correctly, since Seymour was considered an abomination because his mother was not a Guado. His mother was, I guess, human or just something different. I don't think they really say much. But he was considered an abomination by the Guados. Afterwards, Seymour's mother gave her life to become a faith so she could be his summon, and that summon is Anima, which I did not know.
Right. The great fish. No.
And Anima is that giant thing. It's got like its arms
chained
crossed
up.
over, and it's chained up, and it's terrifying looking. And when you get to the end of the game, because there's a section of the game when you're fighting Seymour later on, that you have to, if you summon Anima against him, then he says, "You too." What is he? Hold on. You would oppose me as well, so be it. That's his direct quote. So it's kind of a nod back to the fact that this is his mother fighting against him, like that you took the faith of his mother, and actually that makes sense now because the way to get Anima is you have to go to that temple.
Right, because that's not it's not a required summon in the game.
Exactly,
it's not one that you have to pick up.
And actually, to kind of, in thinking of the different summons, to tie back to their whole Asian, like the theme that they were going for, a more Asian-centered world, Yojimbo is a summon, and that is
one of my favorites.
That's Japanese, right? That's that's Japanese folklore, right?
Yeah, it's pretty, and definitely one of my faves. I always liked Yojimbo. Almost kind of felt like, I get kind of like Odin to me in 10. I always loved Odin in the in the other games, but yeah, Yojimbo was awesome. What an awesome addition. Now, Yojimbo was another optional summon, right? Or was that a requirement?
Yes, he was an optional. I actually got all the summons, and I was mad about it afterwards because, once again, to kind of bring it back towards the story before we get into the gameplay, you kill all your summons at the end of the game. You have to, one by one, defeat all of them. I forget the story reasons as to why exactly, but
because they have to go back. It all connects back to the sort of religion of it and the mythos of where they come from. Because because they're the Aeons is what they're actually referred to as in the game. So you have the summoners, and the summoners don't summon summons, they summon Aeons, because Final Fantasy has this weird thing where every once in a while they're like, let's change the name of what summons are.
You have Guardian Forces.
And then what were they in 6? Espers, yeah. Espers, Aeons. And the Aeons and the Faith are like, the summoners have links with the Aeons and based on Faith's dreams, because I was really confused when I played 10, and I was like, why is Ifrit a little boy or whatever? Was it Ifrit or was it Bahamut? It was like this little boy walking around.
Bahamut's one of the only summons, by the way, that's when you get it, because you go to different temples throughout the game. That's part of Yuna's pilgrimage.
Those trials.
And you get a different summon for each one. You have to complete these trials. Bahamut is the only one that you can miss in those temples. Like all the others you can go back and get if you miss it the first time. Bahamut is a one and done thing. If you don't get it your first time through, you're not getting Bahamut.
Yeah, I think it was, I know I said Ifrit, but I think it is Bahamut that you sort of comes to Tidus and he looks like a kid, but it's like this weird envisioned again, it gets pretty complicated
it's
Final
hard to
Fantasy
explain
lore
unless
does.
you play it. That's the thing I always run into when I'm trying to explain these game stories is like we'll be talking about something, and then we'll be like, oh yeah, that's like this other part later on in the game, and then we jump to that part. I actually think we've done a pretty good job explaining, the overall story is Yuna's pilgrimage to Xanarkand, and that she has to defeat Sin. And originally she was going to sacrifice herself to defeat Sin, and then they find a way around that.
Yeah, and then we wrote the Bible on Final Fantasy X in the middle there. We basically wrote them. I'm pretty sure, because they're like the guardians. The Aeons are these guardians of the summoners because they protect Yuna and on her pilgrimage is the whole purpose. But I think the Aeons have a faith which are the people who sacrificed themselves or gave themselves up. The faiths are represented by aeons through this sort of the dream of these guardians, which is why you see this like boy that represents one of the aeons, which is a whole other confusing sort of thing. But the faith overall, it sort of helps Yuna. High summoner. She's a high summoner. That's what she is. She's called the high summoner because she's like the top of the line summoner.
Yeah.
And it heavily focused on the summons. FF10 is more than other games where they're just sort of these extra abilities or powers. The summons tell most of the story, kind of like 6. So it harkens back to 6 where the Espers with Terra are insanely important.
Yes, that's a good point.
To the story. And then 10, the Guardian forces in 8, they're there. And
they reference something about how they hurt the characters, but they never actually follow through with that in the story.
Yeah. And the Guardian forces in 8 seems like, 8 is heavily focused on the summons, but they have nothing to do with the story. Like, you don't even... I wouldn't even use them that often because it was actually a chore to bring them out in battle, aside from maybe
they were long
a boss.
cutscenes.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting how 10 made summons sort of the forefront. They weren't just... It wasn't like picking up a materia in 7 and it's like, oh yeah, I can drop Alexander on these guys and have them do an attack. It actually heavily influenced in the story.
So what the way Wikipedia describes faith, just because I always find Wikipedia is great because a lot, especially with video game stuff, because generally it's a bunch of fans who are so nitpicky about it. So it's generally you still want to corroborate some stuff, but I always find Wikipedia to be generally pretty well.
Yeah, it's like you got to check 3 different. You have the Wikipedia up, and then you'll have a giant bomb article about it, and then a fandom wikia to kind of go through everything. And
so what it says here is the faith are humans who willingly gave up their souls to be sealed in statues. This link, and so they can establish a mental link with a summoner.
Okay.
This link grants a summoner access to the faith's dreams and enables him or her to physically realize those dreams as aeons.
All right, okay, so I was close. The dreams become the aeon sort of guardian form. So these forms are dreams of other people. And let's talk a little bit about Tidus's form.
Yes, because he is, you're talking about the end of the game form, right?
The thing that threw me and my best friend when it happened.
Yes, so... the end of the game, so you go through this whole game, and I still get emotional thinking about the end of this game sometimes, because you go through this whole game, Yuna and Tidus, they found a way to defy the odds. Yuna is alive, they defeat Yevon, or whatever his face is, and they
had relations in the water, possibly. It's assumed they probably had relations in the water.
And they conquered it all. Love conquers all, right?
Well,
and you find out that the reason why Tidus got kind of absorbed into Spira and what his memories of Xanarkand was that 1,000 years ago there was a war between Xanarkand and this country named Bavel or something like that, and Xanarkand lost. And the members left of Xanarkand, I guess, as opposed to getting overthrown or overtaken, the entire population of Xanarkand decides to become a faith. And so where Tidus is actually he is one of those faith. He is one of the people who has that. So Xanarkand is just a dream. It is this dream that the faith has been constantly dreaming over and over and over again for the last 1,000 years. And as they have gotten tired, sin finally found its way into that dream, which is why Tidus suddenly gets sucked out, because this is 1,000 years later. He got sucked out of that dream into the real world. But since the faith are all still there, he was still there in Spira. So you find out, I guess, Spira is actually the real world, and everything that Tidus was seeing was a dream the entire time. What the beginning of the game was a dream the entire time.
Yep. So
and
he was
when
just
you
another
defeated
faith,
sin, you released the faith from their bonds. And so since they no longer had to dream because there was no sin anymore, they Titus is part of that faith. And so since sin is gone, the faith are gone, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why that has to happen. Maybe you know more than I do.
You would think that they would go back to their form prior to giving themselves up to the faith. That would have been my assumption. Like, I think that's what my buddy Steve and I thought when we're like, wait, what? Isn't he? So, because he just starts dematerializing in front of Yuna, and it's just like, wait, what? And we didn't expect it, because it's not like... Because I will say, most strategy guides were pretty good at not explicitly stating what was happening in the story necessarily, even if you were using a guide. It doesn't say like, and then Titus disappears and dies, or doesn't die, or is undreamt. But yeah, they stop dreaming. He starts to sort of, disappear, and Yuna sees this happen, and she's crying and all that stuff. And yeah, so I was surprised that I just thought that there was something that was going to happen where you were going to see him sort of go back to what he was prior to giving up the whole dream world being brought up from the faith. Because if the faith were humans that willingly gave up their lives to have their souls sort of the statue thing and then commune with the summoners.
The whole purpose is to fight sin, right?
Yes,
so if they gave up their lives to fight sin, to become faith so that people could fight sin, using faith, that's actually like, that is, it's weird because like you said, there's some anti-religion messages, but the whole premise is people giving up their
it basically goes back to the unperverted idea of religion and faith. When you beat the game, it's like, okay, this is what faith is really supposed to be, that you unselfishly sacrifice yourself and willingly give up your life for the betterment of the universe,
of the world.
And having faith allows you to do that. You have to have faith. So the humans are giving their lives over to faith, which is what most religions would say. That's what you're supposed to give your life and focus 100% on having faith in this. And you would think that when sin was destroyed, that the faith would return to their human form. They'd be given back and sort of like the idea of like you're reborn in your perfect body of what it would be without sin, right?
Yes.
So faith, it's odd that it was like, no, Xanarkand was all dreamt up for 1,000 years. Like, we're not going to bring you back. But
I guess you could also make the argument though that now that there's the absence of sin means faith isn't necessary anymore. So they just kind of
instead of bringing them back, instead of restoring their souls, they just release it and you just go into the ether, and that's what happens to Titus. And it's this emotional thing where he realizes it. And he's like, I'm a dream, and so you're basically, the world wakes up. And when they wake up, this dream goes away, and Titus is one of those from Xanarkand. Because Auron does too, doesn't he?
Yes, you find out that Auron had actually passed away.
Right.
Like he was also a faith.
Because he was best friends with Jecht, your father, which is sort of why he's this father figure. My favorite character in the game is Auron, by far.
Auron is awesome.
Yeah, he's so cool, so cool. His style, everything. Always, the dude's all day drinking.
Well, you know what? Let's use that as a totally planned transition, and let's talk about the gameplay. You're talking about you liked Auron's style, so that we can go into the gameplay. I feel like we've really dissected the story. I think that there's still so much more. That's the crazy
One
thing.
last thing I'll throw is that they give you an end credits tease, and you see Titus swimming in the air, and it's like water or something. Like you're like, wait, and then that's it, and the game's over. So it implies like, maybe he's not gone,
and you can get him back in 10-2 then, right? That's the whole thing in 10-2.
So it's super complicated, because then the whole,
even more so than what it was.
It jumps real quick. If we do talk about it, we'll talk about it later. But it quickly jumps in 10-2. Yuna is now basically on a new pilgrimage where she's trying to find Titus, basically, because she feels that he came to her in this dream kind of thing, I believe, and she's trying to find him. And it makes sense because, at the end of 10, you saw there's something, and it's that idea of like, was that just him making his way to what would be heaven in this religion? Because he's now been released from his duties as a dream, and maybe he's going to whatever this world of heaven is, or is he trying to find his way to the real world of Spira? And that's I mean, 10-2 sort of serves as that conclusion, but just the irritating aspects of. Let me just say, there just happens to be a guy.
By all means, go into. We're still talking about story anyway. This is the epilogue to Final 10 story, so this is good.
There happens by coincidence to just be a dude who looks exactly like Tidus, and that's just so like.
That's what it is.
Well,
are you serious?
that's most people would say that's a lame explanation, but that is part of it, and I don't want to get any further into it.
I'm glad I never finished it then.
But just so you know, there is a guy that looks exactly like Tidus. But I guess that would make sense because if you think about it, Tidus gave up his life and then became this dream in Xanarkand. Do we know what Tidus actually looked like when he was given up willingly as a faith? Maybe he was a completely different,
Or was it something that, since they did put a lot more Asian influences into it, was it reincarnation?
That
could have been that too.
I didn't finish 10-2, which we could talk about later. But yeah, the gameplay.
Neither did I.
The gameplay.
So yes, Final Fantasy X's gameplay. This was a different. It was a different departure for them because they kind of got rid of the leveling up system in a sense. Because most Final Fantasies, from what those who remember, it's you go to a battle screen, you take turns attacking, and you get experience and you level up, and then usually there's a different leveling up system or a different battle system in each entry. This one's no different, but what's interesting about it is that this battle system is now purely turn-based. It's not an active time battle. You can keep the turn on your character's turn indefinitely as long as you want. The enemy will not attack. And they kind of did away with leveling up, sort of. It's done in a different way.
Right, yeah, you don't gain experience and then go from level 1 to 2, which randomly or automatically causes your strength to go up +2 and your defense to go up +2, charisma, whatever. In this game, it's all based around the sphere grid, and each character, it does harken back to the idea of character classes, which was heavily pushed in 9. Every character had a very specific class that they fell into, and that is where their abilities lied, which I do generally prefer. Even though I love being able to make every character as powerful as possible, I like that 9 reels that in for me and keeps me from being able to do that, so I can just focus on Vivi's going to be the ultimate offensive black mage in this game. Zidane's going to be the speedy DPS thief. Instead 10, everyone starts in their class, but the sphere grid is universal. Everyone has access to the same sphere grid, but each person starts in a different portion. So Lulu is in the black mage area of the sphere grid, obviously gaining black magic abilities and stat increases based on these little nodes that are based around increasing her natural ability for magic, MP increasing for using the magic points, all that. And then you have characters that might be more tanky that start in an area that's more focused on HP and strength and defense. Yuna's sort of in that area of summoning and white magic, so she's also sort of this white mage character class. But you can eventually break out of the sphere grid if you're crazy, and you could complete every node of the sphere grid with
each character.
Every character, which is what I did because I'm a fool. So you could make somebody the ultimate.
I did
crazy.
that with Tidus. I didn't do it with everyone. I did it with Tidus and a handful I didn't even technically complete it with Tidus, but it was like close. I'm talking like I had probably 95% of the sphere grid like done with him,
which is a major undertaking.
Yes, it takes a long time you have to grind so much, and it takes forever. Well, I will say one thing I loved about this game, and I think maybe you might know better than I, but I think this is the first Final Fantasy game that broke that damage limit. It allowed you to break the damage.
Yeah,
that was one of my favorite things about it. You no longer had to stop at 9,999.
Overkill.
You could break that.
Was it a node that does the damage break? It's a
weapon.
Grid?
You have to get their ultimate weapon.
The ultimate weapon does that. And then there's the HP break as well. You can break your HP limit, so you're going beyond 9,999, which is The standard limit in Final Fantasy games, 9999 HP and 999 MP, both of which can be broken in this game, so you could get into the 5-digit HP levels. You can do more damage than the 9999, which is always like the classic. You think Omni Slash in 7, if you're stat maxed, you can, cap out and do nearly 10,000 damage per hit. And then going back to 7 Remake real quick.
Go for it.
So the level cap in Final Fantasy VII Remake is 50. Okay.
Really?
Which seems like, oh, that makes sense. It's only part 1. It's only like, I would say 12 to 15% of the original Final Fantasy story. 50 is high if you think about it in that sense. If they're going to cap it at 100, the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake is a pretty epic battle. And, I maxed out all the materia and everything in my playthrough. You can be pretty insanely powerful by the end of FF7 Remake. How the F, excuse my language, how the F are you supposed to be afraid of the Midgar Zalem snake when you cross that lake?
You're
right?
not wrong. Either they have to scale that thing to hell and back,
or they ignore it.
Or you're going to have to let your character. They would either going to have to scale it to hell and back and have you keep leveling up. So maybe the level cap would be like 200 by the time you reach Final Fantasy VII Part 3 or whatever.
Right, because the logical thing would be that, yeah.
Or you keep all the stats, but then you say you're at level 1 now. They just look at your old save file, which I don't think it's going to work, because if they switch console generations, how are you going to transfer that over? I don't think it's going to work that way.
Well, luckily, it is possible, because Suikoden did it with Suikoden 2, because the great thing about Suikoden is you could load, because it all takes place in the same timeline. It's not like Final Fantasy where each game is its own world and it doesn't work the same way. Suikoden is all the same timeline. Characters show up from previous games as you go throughout it. Suikoden 1, you could load your save data from your PS1 memory card into Suikoden 2, which would cause certain characters to have better stats or start with certain items and certain armor. And then Suikoden 3 was on the PlayStation 2. Suikoden 3 allowed you to load your PS1 data into the PS2 game, which was cool. Obviously the backwards compatibility of the PS2 helped, so it probably will be a thing of some sort of cloud save situation.
It would have to be cloud-based.
And then it will pull that from your PlayStation account, or by then this will have released, because the Sony exclusivity ends April 2020.
Does it? So it's going to get onto Xbox One.
I would imagine.
7 Remake.
I would imagine.
They have to. They did it with Final 15, so I don't know why they wouldn't.
Right. So that's probably what that is, because I believe there's the sticker on the box that says exclusive on PlayStation for 1 year. 1 year exclusivity, console exclusivity. And then, I've thought about that too. That's another big thing I'm always thinking about is it could go one of a couple ways. They could start you over and not transfer anything over, which I think is a slap in the face to the people who played the first part and purposely...
In any capacity.
Yeah.
You don't even have to be someone who logged hundreds of hours into it. If you just played the standard campaign 40, 50 hours, whatever it is, that's 40, 50 hours of your life that mean nothing to the second part of that game.
Yeah, because you could just pick it up. But then it's that thing of, does it do what some sort of MMOs do, where if you pick it up and you start at like some far out expansion, and they start you at level 40, and you just pick your abilities at the beginning of the game, and you pick up, because there may be, which seems crazy, there may be people who play Final Fantasy VII Remake 2 first.
It's possible. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's gonna happen. It's not even. Yeah. It has, like, just on probability alone. Yeah,
the scale is going to be a major issue, I think, and hopefully they've worked that out, and they're like, well, what are we gonna do? We've got these. The party did all these insane things, and I thought they had scaled it well at first, because it was like, all right, there's only 2 limit breaks for each character in the first game, so they didn't give you all the limit breaks. You're not doing Omni Slash and all that stuff yet, but then there's aspects like you're leveling up to 50, you're pretty darn powerful. Like, you can do max damage in Final Fantasy VII Remake. So they're either going to make the new cap, like we were saying, breaking the HP limit. Maybe in Final Fantasy X Part 2, you can max out at like 15,000 HP or something.
Yeah.
Or they may do what MMOs do, where those first levels go really fast, and you level up pretty quickly, and the cap is 50 in 7 Remake. And then when you get into Part 2, the level cap is 60. But those 10 levels go very slow. But the rewards are pretty intense. So it's like a much slower grind for experience. Maybe they'll do that. Or they reset everything, which some people say might happen. If they reset everything, that would be, like I said, that I would not like. But
they could do a hybrid, though, where they reset the levels and everything, but you keep your different abilities. So any abilities that you had and any of the material levels that you currently had, yeah, the material might be a little bit overpowered, but you could probably balance that pretty well. If they keep it where it's like, yeah, your level resets, but the majority of everything else stays the same. You know, you same limit breaks, same weapons, same inventory, same this and that. So you still carry that progress over. It just doesn't show in the level. And the only reason in the level at that point would just be more essentially cosmetic, because you'd still be that same level, because it shouldn't technically change your playability. It would just change the numbers, and the enemies would already be scaled to those numbers.
yeah, it just seems so crazy to have that fight, or the ending fights of the game, and then to go out into what may or may not be an open world, and you're coming across cactuars, and it's like, it's a joke. Like, everything that isn't a boss should be like a one-hit kill. You know, like, are you going to make all of the random encounters crazy strong monsters? It just doesn't fit with the world. So it's that weird thing of, if Cloud's dropping like 7,000 damage with his regular attacks, and then you go out and you fight a magic pot or something. I guess those are hard to hit, but yeah, it's going to be tricky. But to go back to 10, the limit breaks on top of HP breaks and, MP breaks and damage breaks. That was really cool.
It was fun. And the way you would get it is that you would have to get their ultimate weapons, and the ultimate weapons. And by the way, after we're done recording, we should talk more about Final 7 Remake, because I'm enjoying that. But anyway, the weapons, the way you would have to get them is bullshit. It is some of the most, some of it's easy, and some of it is arbitrary, and some of it is awful. Yuna's, from what I remember, was the easiest to get. You just had to kind of search 2 places. One was on Besaid Island, and another one was in, I can't believe I remember this. This is from memory. It was like from some jungle like area. I don't remember where that, but one was like in a hidden cove in Besaid Island. That was just finding 2 different spots. Yuna's, you had to dodge 99 or 100 consecutive lightning bolts on the Thunder Plains. Not Yuna's, I'm sorry, Lulu's.
Yeah,
Lulu's.
and what's so ridiculous about that, if you think when they made Final Fantasy X 10.2 HD Remaster, the fact that is one of it might even be a gold trophy. Like, they made it a trophy because it's so ridiculous.
It's so well, and so Titus's, to get Titus's, there's 2 parts from what I remember to each ultimate weapon. One was easy to get, and one was difficult to get. There was one that was like, it was something that you found, and another one that was a challenge usually. Titus's was a chocobo racing minigame where you would run through these balloons, and it would take off time off your race. So say it would take you 30 seconds normally to run through this course. Every balloon you popped as you're going would take off a second. So say by the time you got to the first balloon, you were 5 seconds into the race. You hit a balloon, now it actually counted as 4, even though, in real time it was 5 seconds, so on and so forth. So the more balloons you pop, the more time it would take off. And the only way to get the final part to his ultimate weapon was to have negative time by the end of the race. And that was just perfect turns, perfect, like you got every single balloon. I did it with Yuna, and I did it with Tidus. I didn't get any other character's ultimate weapon. And actually, I'm looking at I looked up an interview with Yoshinori Kitase where I got the information from earlier, and one of the questions they asked: "Do you regret how difficult the lightning dodging and chocobo racing mini games were for players hoping to get the ultimate weapons? Were you able to complete them yourself?" And he responded, "The developers in charge," and this is from Game Informer, by the way. The developers in charge of those minigames did, of course, clear them. Personally, I cleared the lightning dodge, but, and then he says in parentheses, cough, cough. So I think he was joking with that. Yeah. I don't think he did that. As a game from that era, I don't regret it. But for example, if I were to recreate it today, I might think them through a little more.
Yeah, or at least make it hackable, because I was very frustrated with that because I'm a completionist when it comes to Final Fantasy. So I was like, I have to do everything. And
did you get the lightning bolts?
Mm-hmm, I did.
Oh my god.
And I went through several scenarios where I was like, all right, how can I jerry rig this to where I don't actually have to do this? Because this is exhausting. And, I'm trying to figure out, all right, so if I get a turbo controller and I tape down the button that dodges, and unfortunately you have to press the button at a precise time when the lightning strikes, so you can't turbo controller it. You can't. Mm-hmm. So I was like, wow, there's no way around this. I have to actually do it. And there were moments where I was super close, and they have to be consecutive. It's not dodge 100, it's dodge 100 in a row, I believe.
Yeah.
So there was many moments where it was like I'm counting in my head and I'm like 60, and then it's like you miss one. It's like, oh my gosh. And I don't remember if you were able to save. I think you could save and it would keep track as long as you hadn't gotten struck. So it was probably I would go get a strike and then I would go save and then I would go do it again. To that, It was getting to that point. I think that's how I ended up doing it. But that would make the logical sense, but I'm not certain if you were able to save in between, because I know there was the little house you could go to on the Thunder Plains to save, I believe, but that's probably what I ended up doing. But man, tedious.
I couldn't even dodge one. I could not understand. Because they would say, oh, when lightning flashes, that's when you'd press it, or thunder flashes, or something like that. I'm like, oh, okay, thunder to flash. I'd hit the dodge button. I would dodge roll, and then the lightning would strike me anyway. So I'm like, I don't understand what I'm missing here.
Timing was very frustrating, for sure. But
it was like I could not get the timing down. So yeah, with the gameplay, it was just cool that you could break the damage limit. Mm-hmm. The turn-based battle system was unique, and the sphere grid was like really fun because like you said, once you broke that damage limit, then exploring the rest, because if you didn't get a weapon or the item to break your damage and health limits, then the rest of the sphere grid was useless at that point, because it doesn't matter how much you up those stats, you're only going to cap at a certain point.
Right.
But if you could get that break, then all of a sudden, it kind of opened up a bunch for you. What was cool about this game too is that you could hot swap between characters mid battle. Like before, you couldn't switch out characters. You could only switch out characters in between battles, and in fact, in some other games, only at save points or on the world map.
Yeah, so you had a select
if you were in a dungeon,
party.
You were screwed.
Mm-hmm. So it was really cool because that always kind of threw me in the early games, where it's like I have all these characters. But I've only got 3, usually. That's the standard. 3 that I'm using in battle. It's like, well, what is Barrett and Red 13 are just hanging out in the background? Where are they at? Because in the original 7, you would use the phone PHS system or whatever, and you would call and swap your party members.
Yes.
And it's like, what are they doing? Are they just sitting somewhere? They're obviously traveling with you because they appear in certain cutscenes sometimes, but...
And they keep leveling up with you.
Yeah, so it's like a weird thing of...
In 7, they did.
10 was... That's what's so great about 10 is the fact that they allowed... It's like, no, everybody that is story-wise with you, you can use in battle. And I think that was such a great feature. I love that for sure. I think it was like, you hit R2 or something to bring them out. Mm-hmm. And then going back to the... breaking of the damage limits, because otherwise it's your standard Final Fantasy battle fare. It's exactly what you expect. You jump over, you do an attack, you've got your magic, you've got your summons that work pretty normal compared to 8, where the summons worked very differently. 10, they make a lot more sense that they come out, they do their attack, so on and so forth. They're kind of there. The thing with the damage limit breaking, that's what you have to do for the end game side quest content, because you have the Calm Lands, where there is this sort of this battle arena where you have these crazy monsters that you can fight. So it's one of those where in most games when you power level, it kind of ruins the end game because it's so easy. And a lot of Final Fantasy games started to do this thing of the side bosses. 7 most famously added the weapons to the American
Emerald
release,
and Ruby.
whereas in the original Japanese release, they didn't exist.
Sorry to interrupt. That was a North American release only, the Emerald and Ruby?
Right. So originally,
I did not know that.
And when it came to North America, they added the weapons, the 2 optional weapons. And then when Final Fantasy VII International was released in Japan, they added the content that we got back in. So yeah, we actually got sort of the definitive Final Fantasy VII version before Japan did, which seems so crazy.
That never happens.
Yeah,
it's only look at Kingdom Hearts. You always had the final mix release only in Japan until the HD remakes and things like that. Yeah,
and then in 8 you had Omega Weapon, which was an optional boss. Those optional side bosses. 9 you had Ozma, which was another very difficult fight compared to the actual final fights. And then 10, they were like, you know what, let's just go crazy, and we're going to have this whole battle arena of enemies. And I did not complete the battle arena. I did not kill all of those monsters. I still have my original. I only have one save for Final Fantasy X. It's not a game that I went back to and played through several times. I have my original save, and, it's probably me at the Calm Lands still working to knock out those remaining bosses. But you have to have the break limits, and pretty much it's required that you complete the sphere grids to beat all of those Calm Lands monsters, because it's insane.
That they had so much extra content in this game besides just all the different bosses. I mean, there's just so many, or besides the bosses, the battle arena, all the secret weapons, all of the mini games, Blitzball.
Yeah.
Freaking Blitzball. We didn't even touch about Blitzball.
That's how you get Waka's final weapon, right? Is through playing Blitzball.
Yep. And what I thought was cool about Blitzball, even though I hated it because I was bad at it and I didn't understand the rules, and it was just I did not enjoy the gameplay of it. It was a cool idea that they created an entire sport. They created an entire sport for the game, and I'm trying to look for it right now. In the interview that I had earlier, they mentioned Blitzball, and I'm trying to remember.
What's crazy about Blitzball is it's not a mini game, and a lot of people would be like, oh, I think I saw it on a list a couple years ago, and it was like best video game mini games and RPGs or something like that, and they were like Blitzball. It's like Blitzball is not a mini game.
That's a full sports game within the guise of an RPG.
It is a full sports game. It is legit a full game, to the point where you are recruiting free agents onto your Blitzball team.
Oh, I didn't even touch the Blitzball after the one mandatory section. I had no idea.
Yeah, you can hunt down free agents to join Titus's Blitzball team, or the Xanark and Abe's is not. That was his original team. But I believe your team is Waka's Besaid team is your home team that you recruit for, I believe. And it's pretty interesting the different recruits that you can get, and they all have their own different stats and everything. And I played a lot of Blitzball. Obviously, I got the ultimate weapon, so I did the full on. I completed all of the Blitzball stuff. But it is an in-depth game.
One of the question he was asked was, before the game released, did you think that Blitzball would be a divisive part of the experience? And his response was, Katase's response was, no, we did not imagine this reaction. Blitzball was something that I pretty much created on my own. Half of it was for my own enjoyment as well. This was because we originally did not plan for it to be something that was necessary to play in order to progress the story, but to keep it as an optional feature where the player would only where the players where only the players who wanted to play could take the detour and play, like a secret mini, like the secret mini game 15 puzzle in the original Final Fantasy, which I have no idea what that is. But he says, however, Blitzball eventually became a mandatory route for the story, and the game was changed so that you needed to play Blitzball in order to obtain a powerful weapon, like you're talking about with Waka's weapon.
Yep.
I do feel sorry to have made some fans suffer because of this, but it would be appreciated if you can regard it as a characteristic of games from that era.
Yeah, and I think I totally get what he's saying, but I think it's way off base. It's almost that thing of saying, well, those mini games didn't age well, and I'm like, no, that was Blitzball was so much of Tidus's identity, even if it was a dreamt up identity. So for it to not play a major role in parts of the game, that's the thing. It is optional, aside from the like you said, the required Blitzball battle. Outside of that, it's not like you had to deal with Blitzball for every couple of hours of the game. It was completely optional. If you hate Blitzball, don't get his final weapon. Use Kamari instead of Waka in your battle party. Stop whining about it. But you go back to Final Fantasy VIII. Nobody triple triad.
Triple triad's awesome,
right,
too.
And that game is completely, aside from the occasional, a completely optional game. So much so that a button is assigned for it when you're talking to people, if you even want to get into that. And it is similar to Blitzball, this whole other sort of thing. A lot of people like to point to Final Fantasy VII as the start of
Final Fantasy.
Yeah, the mini game thing. It has these, the snowboard game and the submarine game. The difference was those were mini games within the story. You did the submarine mission, you did the motorcycle chase, you did the snowboard in the game, and then later you could access those as separate mini games to get scores and stuff. The battle square that you do in Final Fantasy VII, you could go back and then do that for prizes. Chocobo racing. And then 8 was like, let's hyper focus on one mini game and make it its own game within the game. And there's still this huge triple triad community where you can go and play, and they have tournaments and all this stuff digitally.
Did they print out cards and everything, like the ones based from the game? Or is it just done within the guise of the game?
Yeah, so I was a part of it for a while, but there's like this separate triple triad group that's like outside of Square that has a digital triple triad game. And
that's wild.
And then there is, I believe, there's an actual triple triad like card game that I think Square was involved in and released. Obviously, there's the Final Fantasy trading card game that exists, which works more like your typical like Magic the Gathering style thing. But yeah, triple triad lived on, and then 9 attempted to sort of follow that success, and I think it did it poorly because the randomness of it. The rules weren't concrete, because the idea was like, in 9, the cards were like characters, and there was random number generation involved in their stats. So it was almost like the card was an actual, monster or party member. And then when they would fight, it was like they were fighting and doing attacks. And it's like, wait, why did that? There's no reason that the stats were so high on that thing. It's like, well, it got lucky, just like it could in battle, and it beat it. Whereas Triple Triad was very simple, and there was no confusion on who won the battle. Like this card will beat this card, kind of a thing. It will flip this card. And and 10 just it went crazy with the Blitzball. And it was like, we made a whole card game, let's make a whole sport.
And I think it's a cool thing that they did. I mean, that's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
That is so much work to do. It's interesting, too, with their development for this game, that I looked this up. Hold on, let me see if I can find this real quick. I was watching an interview, I think, with him, or maybe it was something that I read. But one of the things that was interesting about the development of this is that, unlike previous Final Fantasies, actually, no, it's on this interview, because they were talking about how when Final Fantasy X came out, it was at a time in Squaresoft turned into Square Enix kind of like shortly after the release of 10, I want to say, because my version of 10 has Square Enix on it, but when it originally came out, you would still see the Squaresoft logo on it.
Yeah, I have the Squaresoft original version, and it's funny they did that with the greatest hits releases of the PS1 games because they were all SquareSoft. And
Oh
then,
yeah,
so
because it
then,
was still alive. The PS1 was still kind of, it was that in between yet where it hadn't quite died just yet.
right. So there were re-releases of 7, 8, 9, the greatest hits ones that had. There's actually, I believe, a greatest hits release of them where it says SquareSoft, and then there's greatest hits releases that say Square Enix on them, which is kind of crazy.
They're probably worth something on the collector's market.
Yeah, to somebody maybe.
But so one of the questions they asked him was, do you ever look back in amazement at how quickly the Final Fantasy games were released? Between 99 and 2003, a new Final Fantasy came out each year. They had 8, 9, 10, 11, and 10-2 within that time span. And he goes, yes, I truly am inspired that we finished developing a game in 1 year with a team of less than 100 people. It is most likely impossible to shorten the development time of any games at the same volume as Final Fantasy that much nowadays, no matter how many people you place on the project. It is a production flow that we can no longer return to as we now create 3D CG games which utilize a production process that is a massive and sophisticated, which is as massive and sophisticated as film production. As such, we need much more time during the early designing phases of the project. Back then, there were times when we started to develop when we hadn't even fully fleshed out the game design. For instance, the scenario for the world after the catastrophe in Final Fantasy VI was not even ready when we had already progressed quite a bit into the development of the game. So they hadn't even written the world of Ruin. Mm-hmm. But before the game even started, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, and now it's like people are, when are we going to see Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2? And I'm surprised they couldn't do that in a year, only because the engine is there. So it's odd to me that, because they already know generally what they're doing. It's not like they're starting from scratch like they were back then. And I get it, the technology's different, it's super expanded, but it's super impressive that they could get a game like 10 done that quickly and it not be super buggy. Because, I mean, I'm not aware of any major glitches and bugs. I'm sure they exist.
No, it was with every game.
But nothing that's, like, obvious. Whereas rushed games outside of Final Fantasy, generally you can think of obviousness that they were rushed. There's nothing in 10 that feels rushed to me. Or really any Final Fantasy game, except, well, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, and I think it's even more impressive considering that development time with how much, I mean, we talked about the scope of the story, of how much the cultures that they built between the Al Bhed language, which, I mean, granted, it's probably, from what I remember, it seems kind of simplistic. They just pretty much did anagrams, I think.
Yeah, because that's part of the game is you can find Al Bhed scripts to decode the language. So when somebody speaks Al Bhed to you down the road, the subtitles will be translated, which is kind of fun.
And all it is that they just replace, like, instead of the letter A, this is going to be the letter R, and that's all it is. It's not like it's an actual...
Right.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's a full language. I think it's just like they found a way to pronounce
Pig Latin, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
It just works off of English. Or, I mean, it would be interesting to see how it works in the Japanese, because that's going to be a very different translation. Right, it's not like they're using 26 letters.
I feel like, you know what, I would have to, I don't know anyone who can speak Japanese fluently. I would have to find someone who's played the Japanese version to really talk about it.
Yeah, I wonder, though, because... a lot of games in Japan will still use English characters. So I wonder if Al Bhed in Japanese does still do the same system. I wonder if it's still English characters that you translate, because, there's that general idea of there's a lot of English language out there in Japan anyway. So maybe they did do that.
That could be it. What else have we not talked about in terms of the gameplay that you would want to touch on before
we're getting there.
We're 2 hours in just about, which is I'm loving this, man. This is so much fun.
Well,
But,
it was important that when talking about a video game on the PlayStation 2 that we basically break down the understanding of religion for the entire world. I felt like that was very, very necessary. I might have to clip that section and just post it on my YouTube channel. Just be like,
dude, by all means.
Final Fantasy X religion broken down with Josh.
I will send you the audio of it.
What
I'll send
a
you audio of the
ridiculous
podcast.
conversation that got kind of crazy, but it's also some I think it's pretty obvious from our conversation that you and I have an understanding and or at least some background of religion, so that's why we might interpret it differently than someone who may not have been exposed to religion in any way, so that those sort of connections, looking at them outside, you might not think that much about it. Be like, no, it's just Final Fantasy X had this whole, it was a religion thing in Yevon or whatever, whereas somebody who maybe grew up Catholic or was a Christian and they're looking at it and be like, oh, I see these parallels, and they understand it in a very different way. But I think that's what's kind of neat about 10, because it is so focused. And my friend who, the Final Fantasy VIII buddy, he loved Final Fantasy X. We worked through 10 together, and then he went on and he finished 10 too. I did not. Because I felt like they kind of ruined. It was like this weird thing of Final Fantasy X-2 was this weird Charlie's Angels Final Fantasy game, yet, because you would think the idea is Final Fantasy X-2 has got these 3 female leads with Riku, Pain, the new character, and then Yuna. And it's that idea of like, we're going to show these strong female heroines. They're the leads now.
Heroines.
Heroines.
Yeah.
And then that's how confusing 10-2 is. It threw me. The fact that Yuna, like I said, Yuna was the main character of 10, and she was insanely strong in Final Fantasy. I'm just
thinking of that's how Christopher Walken would pronounce that. Heroines.
Heroines.
Sorry.
But to take her and try to be like, oh no, she's the strong lead of Final Fantasy X-2, but her whole purpose in 10-2 is ruined, because in 10 she had this crazy purpose. She had to do the hardest thing out of all the characters, and then in 10-2 she's just trying to find Tidus. So you kind of did the opposite of what you did with 10, where you made her this strong, empowered female character, and then in 10-2 she's singing a Japanese Britney Spears song, and she's like this weird pop star. I don't know, but I see people talking about they're playing 10-2 now, and they're like, oh, it's so great, and I'm like, I think it kind of did a disservice to how strong her character was in the original, and it kind of, it was like this weird Final Fantasy Charlie's Angels game. I never finished it.
And even to kind of bring it back a little bit to the religious aspect, she's got a very Christ-like path where she's going to sacrifice herself. She is like, in the Bible where Christ took up the cross and the crown of thorns and all that stuff, and he had to march enduring this pain. That's kind of like her pilgrimage right there. She is walking knowingly to her death. I mean, you find out later she doesn't die, but which actually once again kind of leads into the fact that maybe the not necessarily anti-religious. I mean, maybe that wasn't even like a direct intention, but just kind of in thinking about it like now. I don't know. You're right. Yuna is such a fascinating character. And like all the characters, I think, are, even though Tidus is very whiny.
Heroines.
Heroines. Even though Tidus is really whiny, I think all the characters have these really good character arcs. Tidus and Yuna have the best ones. Like there's ones that don't really get a lot of definition, like Kamari. I don't think you really see much with him. Waka, you kind of do a little bit. Riku has a decent. Actually, no, it's a weird connection. Apparently, Yuna and Riku are cousins.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Isn't that weird? Like, I don't know. That just seems so random.
Where's that come from? I don't
know. I was like, I forget where I read it.
Is that in the game? I don't. Yeah. See, nobody's perfect. I didn't even know that.
But so with in terms of the gameplay, is there anything that we did not get to touch on that you can remember that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I think that's, we bashed the world map. And the lack of that is very linear. I know somebody did a video a while back sort of comparing Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy 13. I think 10 overall is as campy as some things are, and people like to poke fun at 10. It is not as attacked as 13 is. And 13 is always referred to as the hallway Final Fantasy game because it's basically the whole game is a long hallway. I never played 13 at all.
Really?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, 10 was my final Fantasy until 15. I stopped. I played 10-2. In 10-2, I was like, what has happened to my series? What has happened to my beloved RPG series? Why am I collecting dress spheres? And I get it. It's like... And it some people might say, "Oh, well, Dave, you're just being a guy about it. Why can't there be a game for girls?" I'm like, "Well, I think that's more sexist to say that girls don't want to become character classes. They want to wear dresses of a black mage. They don't want to actually be a black mage. It's like reverse sexism."
I was thinking, like, doesn't it seem like this is what a guy thinks a girl would want in a Final Fantasy game versus, like,
right.
Why not just have a female director direct the game? And then that would be the determination, like, where does she want? I mean, I understand that it's not necessarily that simple either, even if you put if you put a female director as a director, because then you still have to worry about what's Square Enix going to make them do, and what's the higher ups going to force them into doing in decision making process, because that always goes into it, no matter who it is.
Right, or tell them to play Final Fantasy X, where Yuna was an amazing, strong character. Like, it's just that weird thing of, like, I don't know what the goal was with 10-2. I didn't do a lot of research, but I made it to the I believe in the Calm Lands it gets converted to like a carnival, and there's all these weird carnival games.
Yes, I know. That's where Tidus's ultimate weapon thing is. That's where the chocobo races are at.
So in 10-2, when you get there and you're doing these carnivals, and each, depending on what games you do, it gains favor with these different factions, and that's where I was, and that's when I stopped. Okay. Because Final Fantasy X-2 added New Game Plus. So it had a New Game Plus feature. And the idea was you would do one faction's stuff, and then when you did your New Game Plus, you do the other faction. So it's sort of a Chrono Cross thing where you do the New Game Plus, you get this sort of set of characters, you get another set of characters. And I was so irritated because I was like, so this game is already telling me that I'm going to have to play it twice, and I'm not loving it now. And I stopped, and I didn't play 11 because MMOs just weren't something I was interested in. 12 came out, and it just nothing jumped out at me, and I've been told time and time again that 12, I should definitely play 12. It's worth playing. 13,
yeah,
and then 14 again, MMO, and I was like, what is going on with Final Fantasy, man? I'm too old to like this new direction. And then 15, I gave it a shot, and I enjoyed it. Obviously, remake I enjoyed. And 10 was the last standard Final Fantasy where you could name the main character, which is a big thing for me. I love to name the main character. And
I know, you always like to name him Dave.
Yeah, that's right. And so Tidus, I don't know who this Tidus guy is. It's Dave is his name, Josh. I don't know if you know that. It's Dave in that game.
I think you're just paying homage to old localizations on the NES, where instead of having a Japanese name, you would have Joe or Bob.
Yes. The original Final Fantasy, you got 4 American letters. Figure it out.
Hold on. There's like where is that? It's Clash at Demon Head for the NES. The main character's name is Bang.
Oh, there you go. See, Bang.
But that I actually think is in Japan too.
Right.
I think it's like Bangu or something like that.
Sponsored by
I don't know.
Bang Energy Drink. That game. Yeah. So Final Fantasy X. It was neat because Final Fantasy X is fully voice acted, and a lot of people. I keep saying a lot of people, but some people would say that voice acting kind of killed naming characters. But they did it in there because they never actually refer to him by name. Because when you think about it, it's rare when you're hanging out with people and in a conversation that you say each other's names.
It's weird if you would do that.
Yeah, you're not always like, hello, Steve. By the way, Steve, John. Like, unless you're yelling for them to come over, you're generally like, hey, what do you think about that? We use the other pronouns. And they worked it like it never felt weird that they don't say your name in the game. So I was like, okay with that.
I mean, even think about it in the context of our episode that we're in right now. Other than me introducing you 2 hours ago, I haven't said, hey, Dave, what do you think of this?
Exactly.
I just said, hey, what do you think of this?
And I've only done it for comedic effect, Josh.
Exactly.
So 10.2 was screwed because 10.2 was like, shoot, we can't call him Tidus in this game, which is fully voice acted. Even though Tidus doesn't show up, you can't name any characters in 10.2. You don't name Tidus again. You don't transfer your data from 10 to give him the name Dave. But they were like, they had the option. They could have named their characters. Maybe they named him Josh. I don't know why you would name him Tidus Josh. That'd be weird.
That's an awful name.
Why would you do that? So they had to keep referring to him in this weird way. And what sucked is in 10.2, she would have called him Tidus because she's talking to other people about him. She wouldn't just be like, well, him, he's gone. Everybody would be like, who the hell are you talking about, Yuna? Oh, I can't say his name because we allowed you to name him. So it's just like she was like longing after this guy, and she never says his name in the game. So weird.
I think it's interesting too because I just kind of going back to like how you like to name your characters. The whole purpose of a role-playing game is for you to be able to create a role for you to play. Right. And if you don't name the characters, you can't do that. Then you're not playing you're playing someone else's role. You're not creating your own.
Right, and that's always been my argument for sure. And then the other guys in the gaming community will try to be like, well, no, that's the idea is you're taking on the role of Cloud and you have to become Cloud. I was like, no, I'm becoming Cloud, so I'm going to take ownership of that character by naming him. That's just how that's how it is. But the important thing is, as long as the Suikoden spiritual successor allows you to name your character, I'll be fine. Aiden Chronicle.
And it's funny too because I am the opposite of you in that I always name the character what the character's name, what the developers name the character.
And that's what Try and Corey do. They are staunch believers in what's the stock character's name, and if they don't give you one, Try will go out of his way to figure out what it should be based on the stock because the original Suikoden game doesn't give you a default name. It gives you the game starts, you see the character, and has a blank slate. There's no way to input a default name. It wasn't until much later with the mangas and the audio dramas that they assigned him a name, which has become Tyr, T-I-R, which is sort of his... And even that, at one point, it was Louis. In one of the mangas or something, his name was Louis, and then it slowly sort of became Tyr as his official name. And
it's a weird transition. They sound nothing alike.
Yeah, again, it comes back to Bang or Joey, which is your best friend in Suikoden 2, but it's spelled Jowy for some reson. So
at least it's not like that's more like Jowy, but
yeah, that's what I used to call him was Jowy because I didn't know, and then I was like, oh, it's supposed to be Joey. I felt like an idiot. But same thing. Most people say Suikoden because they didn't know it was Suikoden. But yeah,
because if you pronounce it like phonetically in Japanese, it'd be Suikoden or something like that.
So it's naming characters is certainly so polarizing. But I want to make a list of the best RPGs where you can, or a master list of RPGs where you can name the main character. I want to have that master list exist. So I don't buy a game and be like,
that'll be a project you can do. You kickstart it.
I'm gonna kickstart. Yeah, there's times when a new RPG will come out from a smaller company, and sometimes that'll be the deciding factor on whether or not I purchase it. I will go to YouTube and I'll search for, because a lot of people will do the first 10 minutes or the first 15 minutes of a game, and I'll search, whatever the game is, and I'll put blah, 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 gameplay, and I'll watch the start of the game. And see if the person got the option to input the name. And if they did, I'm like, I might pick that up. It's such a stupid thing, but it's
funny.
Weird
though.
OCD
But that's how you like to play. All right. So last thing I want to talk about before we kind of do in our like final impressions and kind of start to wrap stuff up. Music. I had to touch on the music. It's one of the first soundtracks that Nobuo Uematsu, I don't think I said that name correctly.
Nobuo Uematsu.
He did not solely do.
No.
There was other people who worked on it. Let me actually check on this. It was Nobuo Uematsu, Masashi Hamatsu, and then Junya Nakano. Yeah, that was awful. Nakano. Uh, and I love this soundtrack. I really really love the soundtrack. I love how it continued with that idea since Final 8 of having a pop ballad in it, but this one I'm happy that it was in Japanese. I mean, I like the others too. I liked Eyes on Me, and I liked what's the one from Final 9?
Melodies of Life, I believe.
Melodies of Life. Sudaki Dane I really really like, and I like how that melody kind of permeates throughout the other parts of the soundtrack in specific moments. One of my personal favorites, which I actually I don't think I'm using it as the end song for this one, but for this episode, I'm using I think it's a mix of this. I hear the Sudaki Dane melody in it, but Sight of Spira. It's got that really cool kind of guitar island feel to it. It's so good.
Yeah. It's the music. It's a struggle for me because there's tracks I really enjoy. I think it's fun. When you're first exploring before everything goes to poop in Xanarkand, the sort of the prelude theme, the sort of pop prelude theme. I was like, oh, that's a fun little reference. And I love the battle themes are really good. They have that classic feel, very driving. The boss battle themes were fine too. The Seymour boss fight, I know it's a very popular track. One of the tracks that the Black Mages, which is the Nobuo Uematsu's arrangement band, they did a rock style of that. What threw me at first when you start up Final Fantasy X and the Blitzball match happens in the cutscene.
Brum, brum.
Yeah, and they use that again in one of the later battles with Ya Papa, Ya Daddy, Ya Boy Ject. That song comes back. Otherworld, I think is what it's called.
Yes, yeah, that's what it was. I loved that song.
I hate that song so much.
It doesn't fit with the game. I'm not gonna lie. Like you look at the rest of the soundtrack, and then you have this screamy, growly metal song, and then you have these beautiful melodic
the hymn of the faith.
The rest of the game.
Yeah, the hymn of the faith. But I couldn't stand that. But I get it. Nobu probably loved it because he loves that sort of like rock, intense music. But yeah, I never liked metal or screamy music. But I like to make fun of my wife because she used to listen to this local band that just I feel like that's all they did. It was that era. I think you and I are close in age. So I think when we were in high school, that the screamo is what it was almost like referred to as. The screamo music was kind of on the scene. And
I listened to it. Yeah. I was one of those people. So I loved in high school. I was really into. I mean, we were talking about, not to get back into the religious thing, I was into a lot of religious bands, like religious rock though, not like the praise music. I can't stand.
How funny is it that there's screamo religious music?
My favorite band for a long time was August Burns Red, and they are a religious heavy metal
Yeah, that's one of the ones my wife liked.
Fantastic. Oh, they're so good. Their newer stuff has progressed away from the like they still scream and stuff like that, but it's got a lot more influences than just like riffs and breakdowns. It's great.
I don't know why. So it's just something. But again, that's just me. I'm very picky when it comes to music because metal is actually very popular within the gaming community. Actually, there's a lot of metal fans out there. I mean, James Rolfe, he's a big fan of the metal. But
I'm into more like electronic stuff now. I still like rock and metal, but like I use like Game Chops. I love Game Chops'
good stuff.
Music. I love their remixes. I also like it because it's Creative Commons, so you don't have to worry about copyright strikes, and it's good music.
Yeah, that does help.
Of course, as any listeners know, I credit them in my show notes, so you can find. I always provide a link to where to buy their music. But yeah, no, I've been getting into that chiptune specifically. I really, really like chiptune music, and not just like stuff from games, but stuff that's original. I had Robot Prince, who's a chiptune musician. He's He's a cool guy. I can't remember where he's from originally. It's either Sweden or Norway. I feel so bad because you don't want to get those types of things mixed up. But he's from Europe, but he moved to Japan.
Okay.
And he lives in Japan currently and has for a number of years. He's really good.
Yeah, I've been really into the last 6, 7, 8, maybe even 8 years now. I've been really into vaporwave and synthwave and things like that. I do like chiptune music. Yeah, there's something about just that 80s nostalgia, that on purpose 80s sounding music. And a lot of it's instrumental.
Like your theme song, like the theme song for your YouTube channel.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yes, it's got that 80s synthwave type of thing.
Yeah, because
I love that stuff too.
I wrote the original track before early in the channel days, and then friend of the show, Kevin Hoover, he actually took that and he made sort of a vaporwavy ish remix of it, which I use a lot for the ending music. Actually comes from that. But yeah, no, Final Fantasy X soundtrack was good. You can definitely tell that Nobu is not as involved, but he did write a majority of the tracks for sure. But there's definitely that. That's the sort of changing of the guard when it comes to the Final Fantasy series, because Nobu took more and more steps back. But it worked for 10 because, like we talked about, 10 has such a unique style when it comes to the world building, and it has that island feel, and a lot of the music fits with that, like the Besaid Island theme and the Calm Lands.
So to kind of wrap this all up, because we've been going for a while, so I want to wrap this guy up. But any final thoughts on Final Fantasy X? Any last words that you want to say about it?
I think I appreciate it more now than I have in years past. At the time, I really enjoyed it. And it's cliche, but yeah, I agree with a lot of the thoughts out there about some aspects of it being annoying. Tidus essentially is a very annoying character at times, but I get it. And I think as I've gotten older and I see it as, oh, this is a story about, it is not my story. It's Yuna's story. It's her story, Final Fantasy X, when you really break it down. And I think she really carries the narrative. And then I think that's what irritated me the most, is I didn't realize it at the time, but I'm forced to watch this story unfold through this guy's eyes who's kind of annoying.
I can agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, if it was up to me, if I would have named Auron Dave and would have kept Tidus's name as it was, which I did in Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX is one of only 2 Final Fantasy games where I named not the main character. 6, it was a little tricky. I'm not going to name Terra Dave in 6, but
yeah,
I had to kind of choose. All right, well, who do I like outside of that? And be like, oh, Locke, right? You named Locke Dave? No. Setzer. I don't know why. He owns the airship. I thought he was cool. But I'm
trying to think of what a female version of Dave would be for Terra.
Oh man, she'd be so hot. Whoever's. But no, yeah. With 9, who do you think I named Dave in Final Fantasy 9? If you were to.
So it wasn't Zidane.
No, I kept his name normal.
Okay.
If you were to grope for a guess. If you were gonna grope a guess out there, what would you?
Let's G squared that. Grope for a guess. Okay, so.
I mean, all you got to do is look at my background, and you'd probably find something that would hint.
Vivi?
Yes, of course.
Vivi.
So to me, it's so weird to think like that. Yeah, it's like I had Dave and Steiner.
I was thinking that too.
Dave and Steiner hanging out.
Steiner is such a he's so goofy.
I love it.
I love him now, but why does he act that way? He looks stupid, and I ended up loving Steiner just because he's a lovable idiot, but at the same time I like his character a lot in retrospect.
Right. You just wish that he had a theme song with a screamo band that kind of sang it.
Steiner! Every time he comes in and you have the screamo thing playing, but then he just kind of trips
he just
over.
Comes in, bloop, that's bloop, the type. Bloop, bloop. His run cycle is ridiculous. Oh.
He runs straight up, almost like not Jackie Chan.
Like Grant Gustin in the Flash TV show.
Yes, exactly. But All right, so to wrap all of this up, Dave, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Still Loading. This is the Final Fantasy X that it deserved. This is the episode Final Fantasy X that
we did it.
This is the episode Final Fantasy X deserved. I didn't mention at the top of the episode, but I redid this episode for two reasons. One, when I originally did it, it was like 6 years ago ish, and it was only 30 minutes. And second, I told you this off mic, this game's super important to me because this year my grandparents have passed away, and they got this game for me, and they didn't know anything about it. They don't know jack shit about games, but they knew it made me happy, and it was one of those things where they would ask my mom, what does he want? And so my mom would say, well, he wants this. And they're like, well, here's some money. You go get it. We'll give it to him, because they still spent the money on it. They just didn't know where to go to get the games, because, that's a lot. Video games is a lot of information for older people to kind of take in when it's not something they grew up with. So they would get stuff like that for me all the time. And I can still remember in the specific where, like, because my grandparents' house it's still in the family, like we're still able to go to it. I remember the specific room and the specific place I was sitting when I unwrapped the game, and I remember just being so excited and like opening it up and like looking at the manual, which rest in peace manuals, but looking it up and just like poring over it and just so excited to play it. And so this game, when I look at Final Fantasy X, I think of them, and I started actually replaying it. Not even before you emailed me back, I was starting to play it because I kind of wanted it as a way to honor them, even though it wasn't something they quite understood. But right. I think of them when I think of this game. So I think this episode is great, not only because it's a 2.5 hour long episode for a great game, but it's also because it's something that my grandparents gave me. So I'm very thankful that you were able to join me for this episode and do this game justice.
Oh, of course. I'm glad I could be a part of it, for sure.
So with all that sappy stuff out of the way, where can the good people find you on the internet? You are a YouTuber, and you have you're a fairly successful YouTuber, if I might say so. That's understating it in my opinion.
Rocking
but where can the good people find you?
The L-list YouTube celebrity. You can find me the easiest way, aside from just Googling Game Dave. But one of the easiest ways is go to GameDave.com, and that'll take you right to the channel. And of course, you can find me on Twitter as well. But all the associated links are on the YouTube channel and the About page. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
As usual, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. You can also email me, stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can do it in a number of ways. Probably the easiest way for you, and it's super beneficial for me as well, is to just give it a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use. It helps the show get more exposure so more people can find it. If you want, you can also check out the Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. Even just $1 a month will help grow the show. And check out the Podbeard Network, the podcast network I'm a part of. Go to podbeardnetwork.com and check out all the shows we have. And finally, the most important plug I have is check out the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of children receiving inpatient care at hospitals. You can go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And that will do it for this episode of the Still Loading podcast, for this episode for the summer of PlayStation 2, and this episode on Final Fantasy X. So, Dave, once again, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
And I will see you all next time.